Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere cold. Not just wear a second hoodie cold, but the kind of cold that chews through boots, seeps into your bones, and turns breath into brittle ice mid-sentence. We're heading deep into old Russia, into the heart of a winter so brutal, even time seems to slow down out of respect. But don't worry, you'll be safe mostly. You probably won't survive this if you weren't born here or don't have a log cabin with some very specific features. And since you're about to become an honorary peasant of the past, you're going to need to learn fast. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, I'm not going to bribe you with promises of toasty slippers and eternal warmth, but I will be your guide through one of the cleverest forms of cold weather survival ever devised. Oh, and while you're at it, drop your city and what time it is down in the comments. I like to imagine where you are while you're winding down. Maybe you're snuggled up in bed already. Maybe you're still at work pretending you're not. Either way, now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive in a clearing surrounded by black pine and birch trees, the kind that cack when the wind claws through them. Snow is already knee-deep, and it's only November. There's a thin grayness to the sky, like it's not fully committed to being daytime. You're bundled up in whatever layers you could find, but within 20 minutes your teeth are shivering out Morse code. Welcome to Siberia. Or maybe it's somewhere in the Komi Republic or a Kangask. It doesn't matter, really. The point is, this winter doesn't care about you. You stumble toward a structure that looks like it was carved directly out of the forest, a squat log cabin half sunken into the ground with smoke curling lazily out of a crooked chimney and frost feathering the tiny window panes. This is your new home for now, for the whole winter. Actually, it's called an izba, and it doesn't look like much, but what it lacks in curb appeal, it makes up for in not letting you die, which is the main thing. As you reach the door, you notice something strange. The whole frame is low. You have to duck, and the door's small enough that squeezing through with your winter bulk feels like you're being born again. That's intentional. Every inch of this place is a passive, aggressive fight against the cold. The door is small, so heat doesn't pour out like it has somewhere better to be. Inside, the air is a humid, smoky warmth. You blink, your face thawing so fast your eyelids sting. It's dim in here, and it smells like birchwood, smoke, sour cabbage, and unwashed wool. You can feel the heat radiating from somewhere central, but it's not coming from a fireplace like you expected. You'll get to that, don't worry. First, look around. The floor is packed dirt, or maybe rough-hewn planks. Walls made of thick horizontal logs still bearing bark in places are chinked with moss and clay. There are no sharp right angles. Everything is slightly off-kilter, like the house was put together while someone was half frozen and half drunk, which honestly is not far from the truth. In one corner, you see a worn wooden table, low benches, and a shelf holding icons, religious paintings that watch you like you've just interrupted a long, judgmental conversation. A low groaning sound draws your attention to the ceiling. Above you, someone is moving around. Grandma, probably. The loft area is the warmest part of the cabin. Heat rises, and in a place like this, so do people. You notice bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, thyme, mint, wild chamomile, not just for tea. These keep the air from becoming an old factory war, crime in the tight, smoky space you all share. And yes, you're sharing. A whole family might live in one ISB. You, your partner, 3 kids, grandma, and maybe a chicken or two that refuse to stay outside. This isn't luxury, this is triage. That wave of heat you felt when you walked in. That's from the stove, the soul of the izba. It's not some quaint iron thing tucked in the corner. No, this beast dominates the room. It's huge, built of stone and brick, plastered over in places, and takes up nearly 1/3 of the cabin. You can cook on it, heat your house with it, dry your clothes, cure your meat, and when things get truly dire, sleep on top of it. You hear a story from one of the older folks here. Once during a blizzard that lasted 5 days straight, they never left the stove bed. Ate, slept, there had a baby there. One of the children was named Petka, literally stove. True or not, you believe it. But for now, you sit by the entrance, warming your hands and trying to figure out how you're not already dead. Because, let's be real, this level of cold is not just inconvenient, it's actively predatory. But that's the thing. Russian winters are monsters. And Russian log cabins, they're not just houses, they're armor. Outside, the temperature drops to -40°C, which incidentally is the same in Fahrenheit, in case you were wondering how bad it gets when metric and imperial systems just agree to give up. The wind makes a sound that's somewhere between a shriek and a laugh, like it knows something you don't. And still inside this strange smoky box made of wood and moss and human stubbornness, you are okay. You even find yourself peeling off a layer. The warmth is that real. You look out the frosted window and for a moment, just a moment, you feel like you could survive this. Maybe if you don't go outside ever. As night falls, someone lights a small oil lamp. The shadows get long and dance across the walls like old ghosts. You eat something hot and sour and comforting. There's bread with a burnt bottom and crust like stone, but it's warm. Your toes tingle. You haven't felt them in hours. In a world where central heating doesn't exist and the nearest town might be a 3-day trek through wolf country, this little structure is the reason generations of people made it to spring. It's not fancy. It doesn't care about your Pinterest board, but it works, and it's about to teach you all its secrets. You wake to the sound of logs shifting in the stove and the scent of smoke that somehow feels comforting now. The cold hasn't completely vanished. It lurks around the edges of the room, in the corners and under the bench, but the core of the Isbra is warm and alive. You roll over on the wooden plank bed, a stack of rough wool blankets weighing you down like a polite bear, and your breath no longer fogs in the air. That alone feels like a miracle. Someone's already up. You hear soft movement, probably Baba, the matriarch of this household, shuffling in felt boots, stoking the fire, humming a tune you don't recognize but instantly trust. You sit up slowly, the chill sneaking into the spaces your blankets leave exposed. Welcome to morning in the Russian wilderness. Same as night, only a bit brighter and twice as busy. You finally notice how the ISB is laid out. There's no wasted space, no spare room, no place that doesn't serve a purpose. It's like a perfectly tuned machine carved out of necessity and tradition. Your eyes settle on the walls, massive, horizontal logs stacked like oversized Lincoln logs, their ends notched together in tight joints that interlock, like wooden puzzle pieces. No nails, no glue, just weight, shape, and pressure, doing the work. It's as if the forest was chopped down, and the trees agreed to become a house. The corners of the ISB, called shrubi, are especially critical. They're made with a specific joinery style called lap joints or saddle notches depending on the region and generation. These joints don't just hold the walls up, they make them airtight. The tighter the corner, the less wind sneaks in. And out here, wind is an assassin. The logs themselves usually pine or spruce, dried slowly, sometimes aged for years, in a sheltered stack, before being cut and fitted. It's slow work, deliberate. But this isn't just craftsmanship. It's survival engineering. You try to imagine the first person who figured all this out, probably someone tired of having their teeth chatter like castanets through the winter, watching their roof cave under snow while the fire sputtered uselessly. So they experimented, they learned, and slowly over centuries the Izba emerged, not as a luxury, but as a life raft made of trees. There's a quirky detail you notice now. The logs aren't perfectly round. They've been hewn flat on two sides, the top and bottom. This helps them stack tighter with fewer gaps, less air leaking in, less heat leaking out. It's a simple touch, but one with huge consequences. You run your fingers along one of the logs. It's smooth in some places, rough in others, and bears the scars of an axe, not a saw. These logs weren't machine cut. They were carved by hand, probably by the same people who lived here after. And the logs don't just lie there, they settle. Over years, they compress, especially under the weight of snow and time. That's why windows and door frames in traditional aspas are built with sliding mechanisms, little wooden channels that let them shift downward as the house sinks, naturally. If they didn't, you'd end up with shattered glass and doors you couldn't open. Yes, the house moves, it breathes, it adapts. That might sound terrifying, but in this climate, flexibility is the only path to permanence. There's also the moss. You see it clearly now, stuffed in between each log seam. Gray-green, dry, scratchy, stuff you wouldn't look twice at in the forest. But here, it's precious. Konopatka, the process of stuffing moss into the cracks, is both art and labor. It insulates, blocks drafts, and even acts as a mild antiseptic. Some families have stories about picking the right moss under a full moon or after the first frost. Is it real science? Debatable, but the insulation is. And when the wind is howling at your walls like an angry god, you're not going to argue with moss. There's a debate you overhear around the stove. Two elders go back and forth in hushed Russian, arguing whether it's better to use peat moss or sphagnum. One swears by peat, denser, more absorbent. The other insists sphagnum keeps insects out better. You nod along like you understand, but let's be honest. You're just impressed that moss has fan clubs out here. You step outside for a moment, the cold slapping you like you owe it money. From the outside, the Isba looks even more impressive. It blends into the snowy landscape, not just because it's made of trees, but because it's shaped like a compact, snow-hating creature. No elaborate angles, no porches or balconies, just a squat, thick-walled, heat-trapping box that shrugs off wind like it's bored. Some roofs are steep and thatched. Others are shingled with birch bark or planks, depending on what's local, and the eaves extend far beyond the walls, forming little overhangs that keep snow from building up at the base smart. You circle the house and spot a detail that feels almost hidden. The whole cabin is raised slightly above the ground, sitting on flat stones or short posts, not too high, just enough to let air circulate underneath. This prevents the bottom logs from rotting, which you know is a pretty big deal when your entire existence is supported by said logs. Inside, again, you sit near the window. A tiny rectangle of bubbled glass, barely enough to see through, but it lets in light, which is a luxury in these long, grim winters. The windows are set deep into the thick log walls, creating a kind of thermal bottleneck. In older Isbas, glass was rare or non-existent. Instead, they'd use oiled paper stretched taut over a wooden frame. It was translucent, not transparent, but it kept out wind and let in a surprising amount of light. And anyway, who needs to see outside when it's just snow wolves and more snow? By mid-em morning, the house hums with motion. Kids tumble down from the loft like oversized squirrels. A pot of casher bubbles on the stove. There's quiet conversation, mended clothes, and a slow, steady rhythm of domestic survival. Everything revolves around the stove and the structure wrapped around it. The logs, the joints, the moss. Every piece is working together like parts of an old wooden machine that runs on warmth, patience, and a whole lot of stubbornness. You sit and listen, realizing that this place isn't just shelter. It's a kind of living memory built one log at a time, passed down through calloused hands and frostbitten wisdom. In here, you're not just surviving winter. You're learning how people turn trees into time capsules and heat into hope. By now, you're getting the hang of it, or at least pretending to. You sit back against the thick log wall, cradling a steaming cup of something vaguely herbal and vaguely mossy. Your bones are warm, and that's saying something. But today, you want to understand the real backbone of this structure, the logic of logs, the mathematics of stacking trees, the engineering miracle hiding in plain sight. Because the truth is, these walls aren't just walls, they're thermal batteries made from the forest, storing life-saving heat when the outside world is too frozen to care. You walk around the ISB slowly, tracing the lines of the horizontal logs with your fingers. They're not glued, not nailed, not bolted in some overly engineered way. They sit on top of each other in long, even layers, each one carefully notched and aligned, resting with just the right balance of weight and friction. And that's the first thing you realize. Horizontal logs are not just a stylistic choice. They're physics in action. You see, horizontal stacking is superior in cold climates for one simple reason: shrinkage. Not the fun kind either. Wood shrinks as it dries out and as the temperature changes, but it doesn't shrink equally in all directions. It shrinks most across the grain, not along it. So, if you were to build a wall with vertical logs, like standing pencils in a cup, you'd get massive gaps as they dried and shrank unevenly. Drafts would sneak through those gaps like smug, little gremlins. But with horizontal logs, they mostly shrink downward, compressing themselves tighter together over time. That means fewer gaps, better insulation, and a structure that actually gets stronger the longer it survives. It's like building with temerarious warmth. The snow loads down the roof and gravity does its thing. The logs press into each other more firmly, sealing those joints with a kind of wooden hug that just gets cozier. And the weight, oh, it matters. These logs aren't just floating politely in space, they're heavy, massive. Some of them are wider than your arms, especially in older cabins where ancient trees were fair game. That weight does a lot of work. It keeps the walls from shifting, braces the house against the wind, and makes the structure feel rooted. A log house like this doesn't quiver in a storm. It stares the storm down until it gets bored and goes away. There's a quiet elegance to it. No drywall, no studs, just log after log, overlapping and locking together at the corners. And those corners, they're the real flex, called rub corners or lock joints. They're hand-carved with curves and notches that slide into each other like wooden dovetails. They don't just hold the house up. They act like thermal anchors, preventing wind from finding its way through the seams. It's basically the Russian version of precision carpentry, but with a giant axe instead of a laser cutter. You ask someone about how long it takes to build one of these cabins. The answer depends on who's building. A good team using pre-cut logs might raise an ISB in a few weeks, roof on, stove smoking, door hung. But if you're doing it old school, felling trees in winter, peeling bark, seasoning logs through the spring, and stacking in summer, that's a year-long commitment. 2. If you're unlucky or lazy, and you better hope you finish before the snow returns, or you'll be living in regret, and maybe a very large snowbank. Here's a quirky little tradition you find fascinating. Some log cabins were built without nails, not just out of necessity, but on purpose. Why? Because people believed metal attracted lightning or worse, spirits, so they used wooden pegs instead, carved dowels driven in tight to keep the structure snug. It worked shockingly well, and if a log ever rotted, it could be swapped out like a Lego piece. Practical and paranoid, which honestly feels like the perfect combo out here. As you're inspecting the wall again, someone points out a strange little gap carved into one of the interior logs. It's a hollow, a little shelf or nook. Turns out that's where the domovoi lives, the household spirit, a kind of cozy gremlin that watches over the family and occasionally eats bread or steals socks. You're told never to insult the house, never whistle indoors, and never sleep with your feet toward the stove, or the domovoi might take offense. You nod solemnly. When the wind screams at night, it's nice to believe someone small and magical has your back. Now, not everyone agrees on exactly how the ISB came to dominate Russia's frigid landscapes. Some historians argue that it evolved from the Slavic longhouse, a communal dwelling used in forest regions for centuries. Others claim influence from Nordic log homes or even Siberian tribal huts. The scholarly debate is low-key but heated, pun intended. What everyone does agree on, though, is that this form of construction is uniquely suited to the vast, cold, forested expanse of Russia where stone is rare, mud is unreliable, and winter is always just around the corner. You take another look at the logs and wonder what it took to drag them here. There are no roads, no forklifts, just sleds, oxen, and some poor guy yelling, "Heave" for 12 hours a day. Some builders waited until deep winter to move logs because the frozen ground made sledding easier. That's right. They timed their construction with the worst season because frozen rivers were more reliable than roads. But all that work, all that weight, and all those hours, swinging axes, it pays off. Because these log walls, stacked with care and trimmed with moss, are more than barriers. They're heat traps. You touch the inside surface again. It's warm, faintly radiating the stove's memory. The logs absorb that heat during the day, then slowly release it at night, keeping the room from turning into a meat locker while you sleep. In a place where temperatures drop so low they freeze boiling water mid-air, that's not just convenient, it's everything. And somehow in this quiet morning light, as the sun barely claws above the treetops, you start to understand the slow genius of it all. These walls aren't flashy. They don't have insulation ratings or vapor barriers. But they've outlasted empires. They've seen plagues, revolutions, and 600 kinds of winter, and they're still here, standing strong, holding in heat like the forest's last secret. You're lying on the bench again, watching the soft smoke drift upward toward the rafters. It curls lazily through the cabin air as if even it is tired of the cold. You feel warmer now. Something about spending 3 days next to a stone stove does that to a person. But there's still a draft near your ankles, just enough to keep you aware that winter hasn't taken a break. It never does. So today, you're going to figure out what's holding all of this together. Not the walls, not the stove. We've already given them their moment, but the secret glue, the invisible stitching between every timber. It's time to talk about moss. Yes, moss. That scratchy greenish-brown stuff squashed between every log in the ISB, packed in so tight it looks like the house itself is exhaling through its seams. You noticed it when you first arrived, maybe assumed it was just decorative, some rustic aesthetic choice to make the place look more forest chic. But now you understand that moss is the difference between a home and a wooden sieve, between comfort and hypothermia. The Russians have a name for this. Ancient art, kanatka. It sounds like something that might involve a pastry or a dance, but no, it means corking or stuffing the gaps between the logs. It's a dirty, slow, deeply satisfying job that requires both patience and a firm hand. You watch as one of the kids helps their father with the task, jamming moss into the log cracks with a carved wooden paddle and then tamping it down with their thumbs. It's almost meditative, like grooming a giant wooden beast back to health. But here's the cool part. The moss isn't just there for warmth. It's antifungal. It's antimicrobial. It's self-drying, in a place where water and air constantly fight over who gets to kill you first. This humble forest fluff becomes your first line of defense. Sphagnum moss is the gold standard. Absorbent, springy, full of tannins that fight off mold. It's like nature's insulation tape, if insulation tape also smelled vaguely of bog and fairy tales. There's even a fringe belief you hear, whispered by the older generation, that the best moss is harvested on a foggy morning in the late fall, when it's just moist enough to be pliable, but not so wet it rots. One woman swears her family's isba didn't lose a single degree of heat last winter because they used twilight moss. Is that a real thing? Probably not. But out here, where folklore and function overlap constantly, you don't argue with grandmas. As you inspect the seams more closely, you see just how much care has gone into the mossing. It's packed thickest on the northern wall, the one that takes the worst of the wind. The western side, too, where storms usually roll in from. The south wall, a bit looser, bit breezier. That's intentional. It lets some light and air flow through, just enough to keep the house from getting damp and claustrophobic. This isn't just stuffing, this is strategy. You help for a while, feeling the rough fibers cling to your gloves, your skin, your sleeves. It's messy work, and you're constantly brushing moss off your clothes, but there's something weirdly rewarding about it. Each gap you fill is a little victory over the cold. Each seam packed tight is another place the wind won't get through tonight. And honestly, if your ancestors didn't think this was worth doing, you wouldn't be here to complain about it. There's another layer to all this, though, literally. Some isbers have double-stuffed seams. The first layer of moss goes in during construction, then after the house has settled for a year or two, sunk down, compressed, sighed into its final shape, the second layer gets added. That's called overkanatka, and it's like a winter booster shot. You ask how often it needs to be redone. The answer when you start to feel the wind in your soul. There's a debate around the stove that evening because of course there is about whether it's better to use moss or modern insulation like fiberglass strips or foam tape. One of the younger men insists on the benefits of modern materials, cleaner, faster, last longer. The elders naturally scoff at this. One of them points out that moss doesn't burn easily, unlike synthetic stuff. Another says he doesn't trust anything that comes in a plastic bag. The debate ends with a shrug and the universal Russian phrase for "let's stop talking now." New? Well, so what? But quirky fact time. During the First World War, when field hospitals were running low on sterile bandages, they turned to sphagnum moss. Its natural antiseptic properties and sponge-like texture made it the ideal emergency wound dressing. Soldiers were literally packed with the same stuff you're currently jamming between logs. That's equal parts comforting and horrifying. Later that night, lying in your pile of blankets again, you press your hand to the wall. It's warm. Not hot, but warm in that slow, deep, trustworthy way that only comes from materials doing exactly what they're supposed to do. The moss, the logs, the gaps, they're all working together, passively holding the cold at bay while you sleep. And it strikes you finally that this system, the moss, the logs, the stove, isn't just about resisting the winter. It's about embracing it, living in rhythm with it. Instead of trying to pretend winter doesn't exist, like modern buildings often do with their bland drywall and hollow doors, the IS acknowledges it completely. It invites winter in for tea, lets it sit near the door, and says, "You can stay there, but no farther." You fall asleep with that thought still turning in your head, that maybe survival isn't about building walls to keep the world out. Maybe it's about making peace with the cold and learning how to stuff the cracks with just enough moss to hold on. You wake up disoriented, not from a nightmare or cold, but from the intense radiant heat baking your entire left side. For a moment it feels like you're in a sauna or maybe sitting on a sunny rock in summer. Then you remember you fell asleep on the stove, or more accurately, on top of it. Welcome to your new favorite survival hack, the Russian masonry stove, or as the locals call it, Petka. At first, it looked like a big, lumpy box in the corner coated with chipped plaster and soot marks. You didn't think much of it, but now you realize that everything in the Izba revolves around this silent, smoldering beast. It's not just the heater. It's the chef, the bed, the dryer, the home spa, and in some cases, a backup birthing station. Honestly, it's doing more jobs than you ever have. You peel yourself off the upper platform, the pilot, a flat surface directly above the stove, and immediately feel the temperature difference. Up there, it was warm enough to bake a potato under your armpit. Down here, your breath is visible again. Still warmer than outside, but the stove's heat doesn't exactly rush to share the love. It radiates slowly, heavily, like a bear rolling over in its sleep. Someone's already stuffing firewood into the belly of the beast. No metal door, just a carved brick arch with a cast iron flap. And the stove itself, it's not some little metal contraption like you'd find in a Western cabin. It's a full-body installation, a combination of bricks, clay, and occasionally stone, built like a thermal battery designed by an actual wizard. Here's how it works. The firebox isn't just a pit where you burn logs, it's the start of a winding labyrinth. After the fire is lit, hot gases and smoke don't shoot straight up a chimney. Instead, they meander through a series of internal channels, turns and bends, carefully carved to make the heat linger, transfer, and absorb into the masonry. By the time the smoke exits through the chimney, most of the heat has already soaked into the walls of the stove, which now slowly release that warmth for the next 12 to 24 hours. 1 or 2 good firings a day, and that's it. No constant stoking, no wood every hour. It's set it, and forget it heating for the medieval soul. You touch the bricks near the firebox. They're warm, not hot, gentle, even. You lean in and there's that familiar dry mineral smell of old ash and warm stone. No hissing, no creaking, metal. just a deep contented warmth that seems to hum at the edge of your senses. Now, here's something wild. Traditional Russian stoves are so efficient they often lack chimneys in the modern sense. In the oldest versions, the smoke just hung out. It floated around the cabin, warming everything, curing meat, and gently asphyxiating everyone in a sort of seasonal hotbox. Eventually, someone figured out how to redirect smoke, through a flue and out a chimney, an innovation both vital and obvious in hindsight. But there are still stories of grandmothers living their entire lives in black izbas, with soot-covered walls and lungs full of history. And you get it. A smoky cabin sounds awful on paper, but smoke is also a preservative. It seeps into the logs, making them less appealing to insects and rot. It dries the air, kills bacteria, and makes everything smell like barbecue. The blackened rafters above you, they're not dirty, they're seasoned. Back to the stove, though. The Petka has quirks. You learn not to sit on it barefoot, not because it'll burn you, but because the dry heat will suck the moisture out of your souls like a vampire. You learn to sleep with your back toward it and your head away. Something about old folk beliefs and airflow, and probably the domovoi getting cranky if you hog the heat. Babies sleep near the stove. Cats sleep on the stove. You, at some point, fall asleep again with a hand resting against its side like you're trying to merge souls with a volcano. There's a built-in niche in the side, an oven really, where you can slow cook stews and kasher. And tucked under the bench, near the floor, is a cubby for drying boots, gloves, and whatever else is frozen stiff outside. Nothing beats sliding your feet into warm, dry Valeni in the morning. Nothing. The family tells you about how the stove used to be more than a heater. It was status. A well-built stove showed you knew what you were doing. Some had decorative tiles, colorful ceramic panels hand-painted with folk designs. Others had carved brickwork or family symbols etched into the plaster. In noble homes, the stoves could be ornate, towering structures that looked like half shrines, half furnaces. But even in the humblest Isviva, the Petka was the centerpiece, the heart. Here's a quirky historical side note. In certain Russian fairy tales, the hero doesn't ride a horse. He rides a stove. Yep. There's a whole folklore character, Ivan the Fool, who sits on his Petka and floats through the sky like it's a magic carpet. Honestly, after sleeping on one, you can sort of believe it. Of course, not everyone agrees on the stove's origin. Some scholars say it was adapted from Finnish heating systems. Others argue it's uniquely Slavic, evolving from open hearths in ancient wooden homes. There's even an ongoing debate about how much of its design was trial and error versus mathematical genius. One theory claims that peasant builders, through sheer practice and generational memory, learned how to create optimal heat retention without ever writing down a single plan. The oral tradition of masonry, warmth by instinct. As the fire dies down and the stove settles into its long, slow exhale, the air in the cabin turns thick and drowsy. Someone adds a few herbs to a bowl on the stovetop, wild mint, maybe some pine needles, and the whole izba smells like tea and tree sap. You find yourself nodding off again, the dry heat pulling you under like a wool blanket wrapped in a lullaby. Because here's the truth. In a place where winter wants to kill you every day, the stove isn't just a heater. It's a survival partner, a radiant monument to endurance, a living, breathing chunk of architecture that says, "No, not today, Frost." You curl up on the pilot again, forehead resting on your folded arms, and listen to the slow crackle of the fire's memory echoing through the stone. The cabin might cack, the wind might scream, but as long as the stove is alive, so are you. The first time someone invites you to sleep on the stove, you hesitate, not because it sounds uncomfortable. It doesn't. Not after days of your body learning to crave warmth the way a sunflower craves light, but because in your modern brain, climbing onto the heating element feels a bit like sleeping inside a toaster. But here in the izba, it's not just normal, it's coveted. Welcome to the pilot, the raised platform above the masonry stove where only the lucky, the elderly, or the cleverest kids end up. Tonight, it's your turn. You climb up using a little wooden step stool, placing your socked feet cautiously on the warm brick lip of the stove. The heat radiating upward is strong but not scalding. It's been several hours since the fire burned out, but the stove is still glowing with stored warmth, like a tired sun that hasn't quite set. Someone's already laid out a fur blanket, and you settle in, nestling into the thick wool, letting the brick heat seep into your spine. It's a dry heat, bone deep and silent. There's no buzz, no electric hum, no whoosh of forced air, just the quiet creak of logs shifting in the walls, the occasional pop from a sap bubble in the firewood, and the soft breathing of the others below. It's like lying on the heart of the house. The platy isn't just a luxury, it's survival engineering, at its most intimate. In a single-room home where the stove is the only heat source, climbing up onto the stove platform at night is the best way to stay warm. Heat rises always, and the pilot is the highest, warmest place in the room. It's elevated comfort. You realize quickly that this setup wasn't just about sleeping arrangements. It was strategy. In some izbas, the pilot is big enough to fit 3 or 4 people. Grandparents usually get first dibs. Practical since they tend to chill, easier and complain louder. But in many homes, the whole family ends up snuggled in a tangle of limbs and wool. You hear stories of 7 people sharing the pallet in winter, lined up like sardines in felt socks. It wasn't cozy, it was tactical. Body heat plus stove heat plus a good dog somewhere in the middle. That's your central heating system right there. And don't forget the chimney trick. On many traditional petkas, the chimney flue runs behind or even under the plate before exiting the roof. That way, the hot smoke traveling through the maze of bricks doesn't just warm the air, it heats the literal spot where people sleep. Think of it as a built-in electric blanket, except it runs on firewood, ash, and ancestral knowledge. You feel it now, your toes, still tingling from the cold earlier, are finally beginning to thaw. You wiggle them. They're real again. You stretch out, arms behind your head, and marvel at how efficiently your body reclaims its warmth when given the right environment. Not too hot, not too dry, just slow, steady, all-encompassing heat. You feel like bread rising in a clay oven. There's a quirky, not often talked about tradition you hear whispered after dinner. Some people believe the platy has healing powers. No, seriously. Not just this is warm and comforting vibes, but actual semi-mystical properties. Old times used to say the stove could cure colds, headaches, even heartbreak if you slept on it long enough. Got the chills. Lie on the stove, sore back. Stove, baby, won't stop crying. Put the baby on the stove, you're assured it's fine. We put down a blanket. Of course, there's even a joke you overhear from one of the older men. If you die in winter, they just leave you on the stove until spring. You stay warm and nobody has to dig. You laugh nervously. From your perch, you get a new perspective on the izba. You see the rafters up close where herbs dry in dusty bundles. Chamomile, mint, maybe some linen blossoms. You spot garlic braids and strips of dried fish hanging like forgotten wind chimes. Everything has its place here, even in the air. Nothing is wasted, and nothing is purely decorative. This cabin doesn't have space for extra. There's a debate going on quietly by the table, voices low but animated. It's about the best way to lay a bedroll on the pallet, lengthwise to catch the heat of the chimney, or sideways to stretch your legs without touching the cold edge of the brick. Someone suggests adding a wooden plank base to lift the bedding slightly off the bricks to soften the heat. Another scoffs, claiming that ruins the whole point. Eventually they agree to disagree and drink tea instead. That seems to be the national conflict resolution method here. You think about modern life, insulated walls, radiators, underfloor heating, all those systems that keep people warm without their ever needing to understand how. Here you understand it all. You've hauled wood, watched the fire burn, felt the bricks heat, felt them hold the heat, then crawled onto the bricks yourself. You are part of the system. There's no thermostat. If it's cold, that's your fault. If it's warm, you earned it. Scholars still argue about whether the palati is a Russian invention or a broader East Slavic adaptation of earlier masonry stoves from Scandinavia or Central Asia. Some say it predates the Mongol invasion. Others claim it evolved during the harsh winters of the 17th century, when famine and cold forced people to rethink their homes from the inside out. Either way, there's no denying that this was a solution born of desperate intelligence. You don't make a bed on a stove unless the world outside is seriously trying to end you, and you begin to understand why people loved these stoves so fiercely. They weren't just tools, they were family members. The stove was where you dried your laundry, made your bread, healed your sickness, gave birth to your children. It was where you sat to mourn, and where you gathered to celebrate. You warmed your body with it, and maybe in a strange way, your soul too. Someone hands you a cup of tea and an apple baked directly on the stove surface, wrapped in birch bark for a bit of flavor and protection. It's sweet, earthy, and just a little smoky. You don't even know if you're hungry, but you eat it anyway. The moment is too perfect to ruin with logic. Later, as the lamp is blown out and the ISB fades into murmurs and breath, you lie back and stare into the darkness. The warmth of the stove settles into your muscles, slow and steady. Your eyelids droop, and as you drift off, you hear one last phrase from below. Don't roll off. You'll regret it. You smile, because right now falling off this stove sounds like the only thing worse than the winter outside. You wake up coughing softly, the kind of dry rasp that scratches at the back of your throat and makes your eyes water before you even fully open them. It's still dark outside. Or maybe it's just that the window's too caked in frost to let any light through. The warmth of the pallet is still holding you gently in place, but the air feels thick and smoky. And for a second you wonder if something's on fire. Then you remember, oh, right, this is what mornings were like before chimneys. Someone's already up and moving below, shuffling around in the murk, their silhouette haloed by the faint glow of embers from the stove. You hear the scrape of an iron poker, a cough that echoes your own, and then the telltale squeak of the stove door, opening. A rush of smoke joins the party. Not a lot, just enough to remind you that the chimney is more of a courtesy than a guarantee. In the early days of the Izba, there wasn't a chimney at all, just an opening near the ceiling called a kina or dimnik, sometimes nothing more than a crooked hole poked through the roof. Smoke filled the cabin during cooking, thick as soup, then slowly drifted out once the fire died down. In some setups, the smoke passed through a kind of smoke loft where meat and fish were hung to cure. You lived with the smoke, breathed it, wore it, slept in it. You climbed down from the stove, rubbing your eyes and blinking through the haze. Your clothes from yesterday hang over a drying rack beside the stove, stiff and warm, slightly singed at the edges. Someone hands you a damp cloth to wipe your face. The warm water stings a little, pulling soot from your skin. Your nose is already lined with a thin layer of black dust. This cabin isn't filthy, it's seasoned. That's how the locals describe it. A well-aged E-bar has layers of smoke baked into every log, every beam. The smell never really leaves. It becomes the house's scent, an earthy perfume of ash, sap, sweat, and old secrets. There's no freeze that can compete with it. You're told that visitors from the city often get overwhelmed by it at first. Too strong, too sharp, but within a few days they're addicted. One guy even tried to bottle the smell and sell it as cologne. It didn't go well. And here's something strange. Despite all the soot and particles hanging in the air, people don't seem to get sick from it, at least not in the way you'd expect. Some researchers believe the constant exposure toughened their lungs. Others argue that respiratory issues were simply under-reported because, well, everyone had bigger problems, like not freezing to death. But there's no denying that once chimneys became common in the 18th and 19th centuries, people were thrilled. Being warm and able to breathe, that was peak luxury. You step outside to clear your lungs and immediately regret it. The air might be cleaner, sure, but it's also vicious. Your nostrils freeze halfway shut and your lips go stiff. You turn right back around and hurry inside, where the familiar smoke haze suddenly feels like a fuzzy blanket made of ghosts. Inside, someone's showing you the chimney, the new kind, not just the old smoke hole variety. It's a brick flue running up the back of the stove, tall and narrow, with a little flap near the top called a zadvishka. It's used to control the draft. Leave it open and the fire burns, hot, sucking air like a jet engine. Close it and the heat stays trapped inside the stove. Forget to open it before lighting a fire, though. Yeah, that's how you accidentally cold smoke the entire family before breakfast. There's a ritual to all of this. Every morning the fire's rekindled from yesterday's embers. Dry birch bark is laid first, then kindling, then thick chunks of pine or spruce. Once the flames catch, the zadvishka is adjusted just so. Too much. Air and the wood burns fast, wasting heat. Too little and the fire chokes itself out in a puff of passive, aggressive smoke. It's not just starting a fire, it's tuning an instrument. The smoky air has another job. It preserves everything, not just meat and fish, but the cabin itself. The logs last longer when bathed in smoke. Bugs hate it. Mold can't get a grip. Even clothes last longer, though they'll all smell like a medieval campfire forever. Some families even believe that smoke had spiritual properties, that it kept evil spirits out or drove illness away. You hear a story about a boy who caught a fever and was smoke clean by sleeping in the rafters during a heavy burn. Science? No, but he lived. Now, you'll find people split down the middle on this topic. Old times say too much modernity has made houses too clean, too sterile, that a bit of smoke is good for you. City folks say, no thank you, we'll take our air filtered and odor-free. Scholars argue over whether the Black Isber was a health disaster or a clever, adaptive strategy. You suspect it's a bit of both. Like most things in history, it worked well enough until something better came along. The stove is burning steadily now, and the cabin is clearing out. The smoke rises into the flue, slipping out through the chimney like a secret. You can finally see across the room, again. Your lungs are a little annoyed, but your core is warm, your fingers flexible, and your face no longer feels like a leather pouch left out in the snow. You sit at the table with the others, cradling a cup of black tea, sweetened with a dab of jam. The air still smells like ash, but it's familiar, now, less like pollution, more like presence. This isn't the kind of smoke that destroys. It's the kind that fills, that lingers, that remembers. You look up at the beams overhead, the soot stains climbing them like shadows. They're not pretty, not clean, not uniform, but they've seen hundreds of winters. They've absorbed generations of stories, laughter, arguments, grief, and gratitude, all of it baked into the walls, carried on the smoke, and kept alive in the flickering firelight. So, yeah, maybe you'll cough a little, maybe your clothes will never stop smelling like burnt pine, but this smoke, it means something. It means heat, it means home, and in a world where the cold wants you gone, that's a trade you'll take every time. By now, you've figured out that staying warm in a Russian winter isn't about just lighting a fire and hoping for the best. It's a science, an art, and sometimes a game of psychological warfare between you and your own house. 'Cause once the fire's lit, the door's shut, and the smoke has slithered out the chimney, what's left is a constant dance of heat, cold, and your body trying to strike a peace treaty with both. And the most important part of this negotiation, understanding where the heat lives and where it dies. At first glance, the ISB is just a box, 4 log walls, a stove, a roof, but the moment you sit in one place for too long, especially if you dare to rest against an outside wall, you realize that temperature inside this space isn't consistent, far from it. This house has heat zones, microclimates, pockets of comfort and icy ambushes waiting around corners like particularly unfriendly spirits. The stove area, tropical paradise. You could sit here in a tunic and chew on cold cabbage and still feel fine, but take 4 steps toward the back wall and suddenly your fingertips are stiff and your nose is starting to whistle when you breathe. Near the door, your breath curls out in clouds. Near the window, forget it. If you lean too close, your eyelashes might freeze to the glass. There are no thermostats here, just instinct and the ancient knowledge passed down through generations. Where to sit, where to sleep, where not to stand barefoot unless you like punishment. This is where you start noticing the architecture's deeper tricks. The low ceilings, for one. You might have thought it was a design flaw. Claustrophobic, cramped, especially if you're tall. But it's actually brilliant. Heat rises. If the ceiling were high, all the warm air would collect overhead while you huddled below in a personal snowstorm. But with a low ceiling, the warmth stays where you need it, between the stove and your shivering body. And those wooden benches lining the walls. They're not just for sitting. They're strategically placed to avoid the cold zones, the spots near the ground, the windows, the corners of the room where the warmth just can't quite reach. The best place to sit is usually along the inside wall across from the stove. Not too hot, not too cold. Goldilocks would thrive here. Then there's the door itself, small, squat, and usually tucked into a corner rather than centered on a wall. That's not for looks, it's for insulation. A big, tall door would let out all the precious heat every time someone opened it. But this one you practically have to crouch to get in, and it slams behind you with the urgency of someone trapping warmth inside like it's the last bit of food in the house. Which, to be fair, it probably is. You watch the family's routine, how they move through the house, like they know every degree of warmth by heart. The children play closest to the stove, and only the adults go near the door, usually with coats already on. People sleep on shelves, benches, bunks, and the stove itself, all arranged not by comfort, but by heat logic. If you're sick, you get the stove. If you're strong, you sleep near the door. Fair's fair. Later, you crouch near the floor and realize something else. The cold air actually pools like water. It sinks, slipping through any gaps in the logs, under the door, along the floorboards. Your feet are cold even when your shoulders are sweating. And that's why everyone wears felt boots indoors, not shoes, Valeni, like walking around with 2 teapots on your feet. You laugh the first time you see someone wearing boots to bed, then stop laughing once you realize they're not wrong. A fringe fact you overhear during dinner. Some old E-bars were built partially underground, half sunken into the earth to trap geothermal heat and reduce wind exposure. It's like a cozy root cellar you can live in. You imagine it now. A sunken log cabin, snow drifting over the roof. The world outside a white blur while inside the stove rumbles and your nose is warm for the first time in hours. Tempting. There's a debate that night over how best to ventilate the ISB without letting all the heat out. One school of thought is don't, just don't. The other insists on cracking the window a hair after each firing to release moisture and prevent frost buildup. Moist air equals wet air, and wet air equals mold. And mold means you'll be coughing up moss in spring. Still, it's a fine line. Too much ventilation and your cozy warmth leaks out into the Russian ether too little, and you're marinating in your own breath. You're told about another heat trick, this one involving the placement of food. The family stores root vegetables and dried goods under the bench near the stove where it's cool but not freezing. Jars of pickles, sauerkraut, and berries sit on high shelves above the warmest parts of the room, perfectly preserved in the steady, low heat. Even the dairy is treated like royalty, getting its own spot based on the season and the room's ever-shifting thermal geography. And perhaps the most clever detail of all, the use of curtains and hangings, not for decoration but for insulation. Cloth is strung between sleeping spaces, draped in front of the door, even hung across the window like a makeshift thermal shield. It's not fancy, but when the wind screams outside and you can still feel your fingers inside, that's not fashion, it's function. The scholarly debate continues in books and journals. Did the Russian peasant class really understand thermal dynamics? Or was it all instinct, trial and error, learned behaviors passed down like bedtime stories? One historian insists they had no clue what they were doing scientifically, but they knew what worked, and that's enough. Another argues they understood the regulation better than most early architects. You tend to agree with the second camp, because when your life depends on heat, you pay attention to where it goes. As the night deepens and the fire settles into its orange pulsing afterlife, you nestle into your corner, bench, blanket, curtain half drawn, and feel the gradients of heat across your skin. Your feet are cold, your chest is warm, your face is cooling slowly, and in some strange primal way, it all makes sense. You don't need a digital thermostat. You're the thermostat. And out here in a log box surrounded by frost and wolves and snowdrifts taller than you, that's not just clever, that's survival. You're sitting by the window now, cupping your hands around a ceramic mug so worn it feels like it was shaped by 1,000 winters. Outside, the world is quiet, quiet in that heavy snow-muffled way, where even the birds stop singing and the trees creak like old bones. You lean a little closer to the glass, and for a second your breath fogs the surface in a perfect circle. Then just as quickly, frost creeps back in and reclaims its territory. The window, like everything else in the Izba, is doing battle with the cold, and somehow it's holding its ground. You expected big modern windows, or at least something you could see clearly through, but no, these are tiny panes about the size of a book, set deep into the log walls, framed in thick wood and already edged in a silvery lace of ice. There are only one or two in the whole cabin, and they're more about light than sight. Visibility optional, insulation mandatory. You wipe a patch clear with your sleeve and squint out into the white blur. A squirrel leaps from one tree to another and disappears into a snow-laden branch. It might be the most action you see all day. These windows aren't an oversight. They're a survival decision. Glass was historically rare and expensive in rural Russia. In the oldest izbas, you wouldn't have seen any at all. Instead, families stretched oiled paper or fish bladder across the frame. Semi-transparent materials that let in a little light but blocked the wind. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And when you're trying not to freeze, works is more valuable than pretty. Eventually, when glass did make its way to remote villages, it was thick, bubbly, and hand-blown, imperfect and beautiful in that wabi-sabi way. The kind of glass that makes the outside world look like it's always underwater. You get the sense that no one ever sat by these windows to admire the view. They were meant to remind you the sun still existed, that somewhere beyond the snow and smoke, time was still passing. You press your fingers lightly against the glass and it's icy to the touch. But around it, you see how clever the construction is. Deep frames set snug into the log walls like recessed aisles. This helps reduce heat loss by keeping the interior pane further away from the cold outer surface. Some are even double layered, not quite double glazed like modern windows, but with two separate panes and a pocket of air between them. That air trapped and still acts as a natural insulator. Smart, simple, completely effective. You notice a curtain next to the window, not made of silk or lace, but thick woven wool, maybe hemp, maybe flax. It hangs from a simple rod and gets pulled tight at night or during storms. That's the final thermal barrier. You've learned by now. Everything in the ISB has layers. The logs have moss. The stove has brick channels. The people have felt boots and fur coats. And the windows, they've got wood, glass, and wool. It's a sandwich of defiance against the cold. Someone nearby explains that in the worst winters, families would seal the windows entirely, stuff rags and straw into the cracks, board them up, cover them with cloth. Darkness was a small price to pay for warmth. They'd use oil lamps or candles and let the cabin slip into a cozy, flickering dusk. You imagine that now? No daylight, just shadows dancing. Across darkened beams and a fire humming behind the stove. Outside, the snow could pile up to the roof. You'd never know. You wouldn't care. There's a quirky little story you overhear while mending a tear in your mitten. Some villagers believe that if you look too long out the window during a blizzard, you might go mad. Something about the white on white, the endless sameness of the storm, how it could lull your brain into forgetting which way was up. Or maybe it was just an old trick to keep children from wasting heat by pressing their noses against the glass for too long. Either way, you decide not to test it. You ask About ventilation, and someone laughs again. In a structure this sealed, windows double as exhaust ports. You crack one slightly after stoking the stove, just enough to let out moisture and smoke, but only for a minute. Open too long, and the entire room seems to suck in cold like it's gasping. You hear the hiss of frost forming instantly on anything metal, the wood walls groaning as their inner temperature plummets, and then you slam it shut, grateful for the stubborn glass keeping winter where it belongs. The scholarly debate of course is still ongoing. Some argue that Russian peasant homes, despite their clever construction, were dangerously underventilated, causing issues like respiratory illness and high humidity. Others point to archaeological evidence of soot patterns and floor wear that suggest regular airflow practices, small vents near the roof, cracked windows, open door rituals. No one can quite agree. But standing here now with your hand on a thick curtain and your face half warmed by the stove's ghost heat, you think you're seeing the answer in action. One thing you'll never find in these windows is decoration. No shutters carved with flowers, no lace, no place for candles in the sill. That's not to say Russian homes lacked beauty. They didn't, but it was reserved for where it wouldn't compromise warmth, embroidery on clothes, patterns on woven rugs, painted stoves. But the windows were working too hard to be pretty. Night comes fast here, and you see how precious these little openings really are. As the sun vanishes, the cabin dims immediately. The windows go black. You light a lantern, and the shadows shift. Suddenly the glass isn't a window at all. It's a mirror. You catch a glimpse of your own face, blurred and ghost-like behind you. The stove glows, the logs breathe. You're in your own little universe. You pull the curtain shut, tucking it tight at the corners, and just like that, the outside world disappears. No snow, no wind, no endless gray, just the cabin, the walls, the warmth. You settle down with your tea and your blanket and think, this is how people endured centuries of Russian winters, with clever windows and thick walls and the ability to close off the world when it got too cold to care. By now you've started measuring your day in degrees of warmth. How close you are to the stove, how many layers you're wearing, how numb your toes feel when you stand too long by the door. But today, you're starting to notice something new. Not about what's warm, but how that warmth moves, where it settles, where it escapes, and most importantly, how the very shape and height of the cabin changes everything about the way heat behaves. Because now you understand. In a Russian log cabin, cozy isn't cute. It's calculated. At first glance, the izba seems low. The ceiling barely clears your head. Even the roof feels like it's pressing inward, sloping gently, holding tight to the walls like a cap pulled down over cold ears. It's not dramatic or spacious. There are no weighted beams, no grand open-air design. Everything feels tucked in. And that's not an accident. It's a thermal strategy. Heat, as you've now learned firsthand, is a fickle thing. It wants to rise, drift, escape. It doesn't like staying in one place. So, the builders of the ISB gave it no extra room to roam. The low ceiling traps the warmth, keeping it down where you are, where your lungs are, where your feet are, trying not to turn to icicles. It's like the whole house is built to hug you from the top down. You duck slightly as you move from one end of the cabin to the other, careful not to brush the beams. Overhead, bundles of herbs and ropes of garlic hang like laundry lines, suspended in the warmest, driest part of the room. That's no coincidence, either. The loft, the gonitsa, if you're fancy, is where the heat collects. Some izbas even have a second half-level sleeping platform built just under the ceiling, a heat trap, a hibernation chamber, the coveted penthouse suite of the peasant world. You climb up there once just to feel it. The air is thick, dry, and maybe a little suffocating, but it's warm, blissfully warm. You lie down for a while and listen to the creak of the stove below, the muffled chatter, the slow rhythm of boots on planks. Up here, the rest of the world feels far away, like you've climbed into a pocket of survival and zipped it shut. Down. Below, the room is organized in a way that maximizes every ounce of heat. The table is tucked into a corner where two inner walls meet, protected from drafts. Sleeping benches are pressed close to the stove wall or along interior partitions. The door as far from the stove as possible. Every time someone opens it, a ghost of cold air slithers in, curling low along the floor like a cat looking for ankles. You feel it. Instantly. Everyone does. And someone always mutters about closing it faster next time. There's an odd thing you start to notice. When people sit, they keep their feet up on benches, stools, even the stove's ledge if they can. Not because they're lazy. It's because the floor is the coldest place in the house. Even in a heated space, the cold clings to the floorboards like damp mist. The temperature gradient from your toes to your head can be several degrees. In other words, stand up and your brain is happy. Sit down barefoot and your feet are having an existential crisis. So everything is arranged vertically. Warm things go high. Cold things stay low. Blankets, food, drying herbs. They're all placed with heat movement in mind. You start to feel like you're living inside a three-dimensional game of thermal chess. And losing means frostbite. And here's something that might surprise you. The roof plays a huge role in heat conservation. ISB roofs are steep, usually gabled, sometimes even wildly sloped like exaggerated triangles. That shape helps shed snow before it piles up too heavily, but it also helps redirect wind. The slope cuts through blizzards, prevents drift buildup, and reduces pressure on the structure. In essence, it turns the cabin into a passive heat, retaining bunker disguised as a woodland hut. You're told that, in extreme winters, people used to pile snow on top of the roof, intentionally as insulation. Yes, more snow. A thick blanket of packed powder helped prevent heat loss through the roof. It sounds counterintuitive, but snow is a surprisingly good insulator. Dry, compacted snow traps air, and air traps warmth. The result, a cabin that stays warmer, because it's buried like a very determined hibernating bear. There's a quirky historical fact someone drops during dinner. In certain regions, isbers were built with removable roof panels, allowing heat and smoke to vent more efficiently in warmer seasons. Basically, the top of the house could transform depending on the season. A winter fortress in January, a breezy chimney hut in July. Flexible architecture centuries before the word modular became trendy. You spend the evening tracing the slope of the roof from inside, your eyes following the lines of the beams. Each one is dark with smoke, polished by decades of rising heat and human hands. No insulation, no fiberglass, just wood, moss, and clever angles. And somehow, it's working better than half the modern apartments you've lived in. There's a debate, naturally. Some argue that taller ceilings could have made the space feel less claustrophobic, that maybe comfort was sacrificed for warmth. But no one here seems to agree. In this place, open space is luxury for another season. Maybe in summer when the wind is kind and the stove sleeps, but in winter. Low ceilings mean survival. You can't be poetic about open air when your eyelashes are freezing together by the time you tuck yourself into bed on the bench, this time under 3 layers of thick wool. You feel the shape of the cabin like you feel your own bones. Everything is close, not cramped, close. The roof presses in just enough to hold in the heat. The walls are thick enough to ignore the storm howling outside. The stove hums low and constant, and the ceiling above it traps every sigh of warmth like it's collecting treasure. You close your eyes and realize this. Cabin doesn't fight the cold, it outsmarts it. With every log, every curve of the roof, every inch of low ceiling, it's saying, fine, be cold, but not in here. And somehow that promise wraps around you like the thickest blanket of all. The cold has changed. It's no longer sharp and hostile like it was when you first stepped into this world. Now it's something different, deceptive, sneaky, the kind of cold that doesn't scream. It just waits. And the only reason you're still breathing comfortably is because this cabin doesn't just warm you. It knows how to keep things cold in all the right places, too. Because not everything in a Russian winter can or should be warm. Food, for one. You walk into a small back area of the ISB that might be called a pantry, though it feels more like a glorified cupboard. It's built into a corner that never gets direct stove heat. No windows, low to the ground. The air back here is dry, chilly, and smells like dried mushrooms. Dusty sacks and the faint sour tang of fermentation. This, you realize, is the family's refrigerator. No humming appliance, no humming anything, just cold air, clever placement, and deep respect for what nature already offers. A root cellar would be ideal, they tell you. Some homes have them. Trapdoors in the floor that lead down into dark stone pits full of turnips, potatoes, carrots, onions, and beets, vegetables that last through 5 months of frost and still taste like something you could chew without crying. You're told that in late fall, families would haul down basket after basket, sometimes even wrapping the most sensitive produce in old clothes or straw, tucking them in like babies. No rot, no spoilage, just patient, icy storage. You open a wooden crate and find apples wrapped in hay. The smell hits you, sharp, sweet, faintly musty. They're from September, still edible, still crisp, stored without chemicals, plastic, or a single cold pack. It's all about placement, distance from the stove, layering, airflow. These people are food preservation experts, and they don't even use that word. And then there's the meat. No freezers here. Instead, slabs of pork and fish hang from wooden beams strung up with twine coated in salt and smoke. A preserved wonderland. Outside, the cold is harsh enough to turn a side of beef into a stone sculpture in an hour. In some cases, food is stored literally on the porch. Because when it's +30, why wouldn't you use the whole world as your freezer? But it goes beyond just dumping things in snowbanks. You see salted fish drying on racks, smoked sausages, coiled like ropes, glass jars lined up like soldiers, each one full of pickled vegetables, mushrooms, and summer, sun-sealed under vinegar. Bright red tomatoes, cabbage chopped and brined, dill cucumbers packed so tightly you wonder if they ever stop crunching. A rainbow of food and a house made of wood and soot. Somehow it works. Nothing is wasted, nothing is thrown out. Everything has a place, a process, a season. You help prepare a midday meal and notice how everything comes together from opposite ends of the temperature spectrum. Boiled potatoes steaming on the stove next to cold sauerkraut served straight from the cellar. Chilled salted herring paired with hot cash. You're told that warm and cold are always balanced here, even in food. Too much warmth and you forget the world outside. Too much cold and you start losing feeling in your soul, harmony even in the pantry. Later, you're handed a bowl of a kroska, a cold soup usually eaten in summer, but out here still enjoyed year-round. It's made with raw vegetables, boiled eggs, and chunks of meat, all floating in a fizzy mix of kvass and sour cream. Yes, cold soup in winter. You hesitate, but after one taste you're a believer. It's sharp, tangy, and weirdly refreshing. Not everything has to be hot to warm you. As the wind howls outside, you're shown the final layer of food preservation, buried storage. In the summer, holes are dug deep into the frozen ground, lined with bark or wooden planks and sealed with stone lids inside. Butter wrapped in, birch bark, rendered lard, jars of jam, even frozen berries. They stay untouched until a thaw or a party. You imagine digging through a snowbank in January just to retrieve a scoop of cranberry, preserves for a holiday cake. Seems extreme until you realize how sweet it would taste after a month of salted fish and gray cabbage. There's a strange moment that night as you sip warm broth by the stove and look at the neat rows of stored food when you realize something. The house isn't just warm, it's strategic. Heat where you live, cold where you store. A balance, struck not by accident, but by centuries of people watching, adjusting, and surviving. The ISB is not just a shelter. It's a living, breathing system, a climate zone, a series of temperature decisions made one cabbage jar at a time. A quirky fact you hear from one of the elders. Back in the day, some cabins were actually built in pairs, with one heated lived-in ISB and one unheated structure used purely for food storage. The second cabin stayed frozen, all winter, doubling as both freezer and walk-in pantry. When a big celebration came around, you'd trudge through the snow, unlock the icebox of your dreams, and return with the good stuff. There's debate among historians about how much science peasant builders actually understood. Did they really design these cold zones, or did they just stumble into them out of necessity? Some argue it was intuitive genius, trial and error, passed down until it became instinct. Others insist there was a deep empirical knowledge beneath it all, a form of rural engineering hidden in lullabies and chores. You're inclined to believe it was both. You tuck into your blanket, again belly full of warm porridge and cold pickles, and feel the house shift around you, not physically, but in function. The warmth from the stove still pulses through the floorboards, but beyond that, the coolness returns. You feel the separation now. The living zone, the storage zone, the zones that welcome breath and heat, and the ones that cling to the frost like its treasure. The izba is not a blunt tool, it's a scalpel, a knife that carves out life in a landscape that would rather erase you. It keeps you warm, yes, but more importantly, it keeps the right things cold. You're half awake, still cocooned in a blanket that smells faintly of wood smoke and wool when you hear the sound. It's not footsteps, not human anyway, more like a soft rustling, a delicate pecking, followed by the unmistakable cluck of a chicken, expressing a very firm opinion. You open your eyes and there it is, a fat, satisfied-looking hen standing on the hearth, her head tilted at you like she owns the place. And maybe in her mind she does, because in a Russian log cabin, during winter, animals don't live outside, they move in. You sit up, slowly, just in time to spot a small goat handling past the doorway, trailing straw and chewing something that may or may not have once been part of a mitten. You blink a few times, wondering if you're hallucinating from too much beet soup. But no, this is very real and very practical. The truth is, in villages across Russia, people and animals have shared winter space for centuries, not as pets, but as part of a carefully balanced household ecosystem. You'd never know it from looking at the outside of the ISB. Its clean lines and solid walls give off the vibe of a strictly human domain. But once winter clamps its icy jaws around the countryside, the line between barn and bedroom gets a little blurry. The chicken struts off and someone hands you a bowl of hot porridge without comment. Apparently animals in the house are just Tuesday. You take your food and scoot over to the corner bench, noticing for the first time a partitioned-off area, near the door, walled in halfway with rough boards. Behind it a pig, a literal pig, snoring softly under a pile of hay, her sides rising and falling like a bellows. You half expect her to open one eye and nod at you like, welcome to the neighborhood. It's not filth, it's not chaos, it's cohabitation. And it's brilliant. Each creature plays a role in the winter survival plan. Chickens lay eggs if they stay warm enough. A goat provides milk and occasionally attitude. Pigs offer body heat, future bacon, and a surprising level of intelligence. In a world where resources are scarce, the warmth and usefulness of even a small animal can be the difference between making it to spring or not. You learn that some izbas were built with dual room designs, a heated living space for humans and a separate unheated or semi-heated room, usually called a sey or klet, for storing tools, firewood, and yes, animals. But in the worst winters, even those walls were more of a suggestion than a boundary. Doors stayed open, straw was scattered, and the animals wandered through like slightly rude roommates who didn't believe in personal space. You ask someone about sanitation and they shrug. It's not perfect, they say, but it's warm and nobody's freezing to death. So, and honestly, that's hard to argue with. There's a long-standing tradition, especially in northern Russia, of designing homes with livestock in mind. The floor near the door is often sloped slightly for easy cleaning. In some cases, wooden channels are built into the boards to help sweep out waste and snowmelt. It's not fancy. It's not glamorous, but it works. And in this world, working is all that matters. You overhear a story about an old man who used to let his cow into the ISB during the worst storms, not just to save the cow, but to save the man. The heat from the animal's body raised the cabin's temperature by several degrees, and when firewood was scarce, the The cow's presence literally kept the family alive. One cow, one life raft in a house of logs. There's also a quirky tale someone tells you after dinner. In some regions it was believed that chickens could sense evil spirits. So families would keep one near the stove, not just for eggs, but as a kind of feathery ghost detector. If the hen suddenly stopped clucking or stared too long at a dark corner, you were supposed to toss a handful of salt over your shoulder and maybe sleep with a knife under your pillow just in case. Whether that was more for the spirits or the chicken remains unclear. As you go about your day, dodging the occasional goat nibble and stepping carefully around a disgruntled cat who clearly thinks you're a guest overstaying your welcome, you realize something. This system isn't chaos, it's balance. The humans feed the animals. The animals provide food, heat, and warning squawks. In return, they get shelter, scraps, and the right to roam the kitchen like tiny, confused guests at a dinner party. At night, it's surprisingly peaceful. The animals settle in just like the people do. The pig burrows into her straw. The chickens perch on a beam near the stove. The cat, of course, claims the warmest spot and dares anyone to challenge her. There's a chorus of soft breathing, occasional shuffling, and the crackle of embers. It's not the sound of wilderness. It's the sound of a household. You lie awake on your bench, blanket pulled up to your chin, listening to the quiet rustle of feathers and fur. It feels weirdly safe, like the house isn't just full, it's alive. Not just humans, but a small, scrappy collection of mammals, all crammed into one smoky wooden box, sharing breath and heat and space. Because the world outside has made it clear no one survives alone. There's a debate among historians, of course there is, about whether this setup was healthy. Was it sanitary? Probably not by modern standards. Did it contribute to the spread of disease? Possibly. But when you're staring down 6 months of sub-zero nights with no electricity and no plan B, the question isn't, is it ideal? The question is, does it work? And the answer every time is yes. You drift off with a chicken, clucking softly in the dark, the stove humming, and a goat gently snoring somewhere near the door. It's not the winter you expected. It's better because it's shared. You're up before the sun, though calling it up is generous. The sun barely scrapes the horizon here, like even it's thinking, nah, not worth it. The cabin is still dim, the air heavy with sleep and the tang of smoke and cabbage. You pull on your layers, wool shirt, second wool shirt, a thick felt vest, and trousers lined with what you hope is sheep and not mystery animal. Then come the socks, 2 pairs, minimum, and finally the Valeni. Those miracle boots made of compressed felt that feel like stepping into your own personal furnace. Welcome to the Russian peasant version of dressing, the great art of not freezing to death. Clothing here isn't fashion, it's armor. Not a single piece is chosen because it looks good. Every layer, every scrap is about survival. You reach for a coat that weighs roughly the same as a small child. It's coarse wool on the outside, rough spun and scratchy enough to sand your skin if you're not careful, and lined with homespun linen. You wrap a scarf around your neck and another over your mouth and nose until you're breathing through a filter of damp wool and your own steam. You're told that if your cheeks start to tingle out there, it means nothing. If they go numb, also nothing. But if they suddenly stop feeling numb and start to feel warm, again, that's when you panic. That's when the frostbite, already writing your eulogy. The people around you dress the same way, but faster. They've been doing this their whole lives. You watch Baba tie a shawl around her head with practiced hands, then toss on a sheepskin coat with the kind of casual confidence most people reserve for making toast. She tucks a small iron key into her inner pocket. You ask what it's for. Door, she says, then winks. Or wolves, depends on the day. There's no closet here, no wardrobe bursting with choices. Most people have 1 winter outfit, maybe 2 if they're lucky. Clothing gets rotated, not changed. Layers go on and come off like shingles on a roof. Slowly, deliberately. Your socks might double as mittens. Your scarf might end up as an emergency chicken wrap. It's all fluid, all interchangeable. Warmth trumps aesthetics every time you step outside for morning chores, and the cold hits like a slap. Not just on your skin, but inside your lungs. Every breath burns. The moisture in your nostrils freezes instantly. You've got a wool balaclava wrapped over most of your face, but your eyelashes clump together, frost curling at the edges like the world's most miserable mascara. Your hands are the real problem. Mittens here aren't cute accessories. They're critical infrastructure. You're wearing thick felted wool mitts that make your hands look twice their usual size. They're clumsy. Sure, you could never use a phone screen with them if such a thing existed in this world, but you could probably grab a burning log without noticing. For warmth, they're unmatched. For fine motor skills, well, let's just say you're going to spill some soup today. There's a quirky tradition someone mentions while you're hauling a bucket of water. Felt boots aren't just worn. They're dried carefully every night, stuffed with straw or hung near, but not too near, the stove. If they get wet and freeze, they're useless. Worse than useless, actually, they become foot traps. More than one poor soul has lost toes to improperly dried boots. So you treat them with reverence, like a second pair of lungs. You pause to help someone chop wood, an activity that turns out to be both a heat source and a punishment. You shed a layer, then another. The cold air stings against your damp shirt, but the sweat pours anyway. This is why no one gets fat in winter, someone jokes. You believe them. You also start wondering if one of your ribs cracked, just a little. There's a debate around the table at breakfast. Some say wool is the king of winter. Others argue for sheepskin. Wool keeps warmth even when it's wet. Sheepskin blocks wind better. One woman claims her grandmother had a coat so thick it stopped a bear bite. You want to call bluff, but honestly, after the week you've had, you believe it. Another man brings up felted dog hair. Yes, dog. In some regions, people collected the soft undercoat from long-haired breeds, spun it into yarn, and wove it into mittens. Apparently, it's warmer than sheep's wool and smells like loyalty. You're half tempted to start brushing the village mud. And there's a fringe historical fact that catches your attention. Some Russian soldiers in older times used to line their boots with dried moss or hay as insulation. Not because they were out of options, but because it worked. Moss holds heat, hay traps air. Nature again proving that it figured all this out long before people gave it a name. By midday, your layers have shifted. You've taken off the outermost coat briefly while working by the firewood pile. You're down to your base layers, which are still thicker than most modern jackets. Under all that wool, your skin is damp, your face red, but you're not cold, you're managing. You've learned to move to stay warm and to pause in the right spot before the chill sneaks in. It's not just about adding layers, it's about regulating, knowing when to vent heat, when to wrap tighter, when to use the shawl as a face mask, and when to fold it back. The people around you seem to do it without thinking. Their bodies have memorized the cues. Yours is still learning. That night, as you pull off your boots and shake out straw from your socks, you think about the strange intimacy of dressing for winter. Every piece of clothing here tells a story. The mittens were knitted by a cousin. The vest was made from an uncle's old coat. The scarf once belonged to someone who didn't survive the last harsh winter. You wrap yourself in other people's survival. It's humbling. You fall asleep, bundled in layers, each one a silent barrier between you and the dark cold pressing against the logs. And, for the first time since arriving, you don't dream of central heating. You dream of felt and fur and fire, and you dream of making it to spring, one layer at a time. There's no privacy here. You figure that out around day 4 when you're trying to wash your feet in a wooden basin while 3 other people eat dinner 2 feet away. A child runs by with a squealing chicken under their arm, and someone else is loudly discussing whether the pickled cabbage has started to go sour, or if that's just the normal level of sour. You pause mid-scrub and realize this cabin isn't a house, it's a hive. And the only way anyone gets through a Russian winter is by living elbow to elbow, breath to breath, and accepting that personal space is more of a summer concept. The izba is many things, but spacious is not one of them. You count 7 people, 3 animals, 2 sleeping platforms, 1 stove, 0 secrets. You know everyone's schedule by heart. You know who snores, who mumbles in their sleep, and who sings to the goat before milking. You know that the old man scratches his leg for 10 minutes every night before bed, and that someone, no one will admit who, always steals an extra slice of black bread when they think no one's looking. You'd think this would be unbearable, but it's not. It's grounding. In the way that a fire is grounding or gravity or being hugged a little too tightly in this frozen world, warmth is a group project, and everyone has to participate. You find your own rhythm. You stop cringing when someone brushes past you in the cramped space. You stop minding when conversations roll on while you're trying to sleep. You even stop flinching when the goat steps on your foot for the 6th time because her hooves are blunt and her breath is warm. And she, like you, is just trying to get through this. You notice how the family's life is built around invisible boundaries. Not walls, not doors, but patterns. The table is for meals, but also for card games, sewing, and occasional napping. The bench is a bed at night, a pantry shelf during the day. The stove is a place to cook, warm your hands, dry your socks, and sometimes cry quietly when you think no one's paying attention. Even arguments follow rules. Voices rise, but never too much. Disagreements are aired like laundry, brief, necessary, then folded away again. There's no room for grudges here, no space for sulking. If you don't resolve it before nightfall, you'll be stuck under the same blanket with the person you're angry at, sharing body heat and trying not to elbow them in the ribs. Conflict is expensive. Heat is precious. Choose wisely. You ask someone about this, about how people manage year after year packed into a single room for months. They shrug. We talk, we laugh, we argue, we get tired of each other, but it's better than dying alone in the snow. Hard to argue with that. You learn quickly that sharing is a survival skill. Food, warmth, silence, time. Nothing belongs to one person alone. When one child gets a cough, someone rubs mustard paste on their chest. When someone's gloves wear thin, a pear appears from a neighbor. When a pot of soup is too salty, someone else tosses in a boiled potato without saying a word. There's a kind of trust here you haven't seen before. Not loud or performative, just quiet, practiced reliance. Community isn't something you build. It's something you're folded into like dough, like wool. It's messy. It sticks, and sometimes it burns at the edges, but it feeds everyone. A quirky story comes up one night over dinner as everyone passes around cups of weak tea and slices of dark rye with onion. One of the elders remembers a year when the winter was so cold the ink in their pen froze mid-letter. He didn't bother finishing it. "What's the point of writing?" he says, "when everyone I care about is in this room." There's a pause. No one responds. Then someone farts and the room erupts into laughter and the moment is gone, but it lingers in your chest like steam. There's an unspoken rule about privacy, though. Everyone respects the stove as a sacred zone, especially when someone's curled up on top of it, face turned to the wall, not talking. That's your do not disturb signal. No one asks why. No one comments. They just shift their attention and wait. In a house this small, privacy is emotional, not physical. You learn to read faces like maps, track silences like footsteps, and know when to stay out of someone's way without needing a single word. That night, you find yourself caught in a tangle of limbs, cats, and wool blankets on the bench. You're squeezed between a snoring uncle and a child who's somehow sleeping horizontally. It's hot, cramped, and smells like firewood, onions, and unwashed feet. And somehow, you're content, maybe even safe, because for the first time in your life, you're not alone in the dark. And you start to wonder if that's the real secret to surviving winter. Not the stove, not the moss, not even the layers, but the people. The strange, loud, stubborn, generous crowd that fills the cabin with breath and sound and warmth. Historians debate whether these close quarters contributed to health problems, family tension, emotional strain. Of course, they did. No system is perfect, but they also created bonds so strong the generations of families stayed in the same village, the same is century after century. The winter forged them together, like metal in fire. You close your eyes, feeling someone shift beside you, a knee knocking your own. You're packed in tight, unable to move, barely able to breathe through your blanket. But you're warm, you're held, and you're starting to understand that in this place, closeness isn't just a necessity, it's the point. You've now reached the part of winter where the snow doesn't fall. It just exists, always there, always deep, always waiting to surprise you with how much more of it the sky can produce without running out. The wind has gone from aggressive to bored, sweeping across the fields in slow, steady sighs that carry ice in their breath, and the cabin, the Isba, stands like it's bracing itself for round 400 of this frozen boxing match. But today, you learn something that flips the rules on their head. Snow isn't the enemy. In fact, around here, snow is insulation. It starts when someone casually mentions needing to add snow to the roof. You blink. Surely they meant clear snow from the roof, right? After all, in every other world you've known, heavy snow is a threat. Something that caves in carports, floods attics, and collapses garage doors like cardboard. But no, here they're grabbing long poles, gently heaving snow up onto the roof in neat piles like frosting a cake. You watch, jaw slightly open as they work with practiced ease. Why, you ask, genuinely baffled. For warmth, comes the answer, as if that's obvious, and then it clicks. Snow in its strange paradoxical glory is one of nature's best insulators. When it's dry and packed, it traps air like wool or moss beneath a blanket of snow. Heat loss through the roof slows down dramatically. The snow acts like a second ceiling, one that nature kindly provides for free, assuming you've got the guts to let it pile up. You step outside and squint at the roof. It's not sagging, not groaning, not giving in. That's because the roof was built to hold the weight, steep and strong with thick beams and a careful pitch that distributes pressure like a champ. In fact, the shape is intentional. It lets the snow rest without building up dangerously near the edges. You realize this whole time you've misunderstood the cabin's relationship with winter. It doesn't fight the snow, it uses it. You walk around the ISB and start to see it everywhere. Snowbanks pressed high against the outside walls, especially on the northern side where the wind hits hardest. At first you assume this was just drift, an accident of nature. But no, it's intentional. Shoveling snow against the house creates an insulating barrier. It plugs gaps, seals out wind, and forms a frozen buffer that keeps the inside warmer. The cold is on your side as long as you trap it in the right places. There's even a tradition you hear about where entire cabins are buried in snow by design, leaving just a narrow path to the door and a chimney poking through like a periscope. The entrance is kept low, the path walled in with packed snow. Again, not to clear it, but to use it as a shield. People dig little snow tunnels to reach outhouses, sheds, and neighbors. It's like living in a world sculpted from ice and strategy. Someone tells you about ice windows, too. In places where glass was unavailable or smashed by storms, villagers would carve thin slabs of river ice and mount them into window frames. The light still came through, bluish and dim, but it kept the wind out and the inside calm. Sure, they melted slowly from the heat, but by the time that happened, it was spring, and the problem had already solved itself. There's a story, possibly more folklore than fact, about a man who insulated his entire cabin using snow-filled sacks stacked along the walls. It worked so well that, in the spring when the snow melted, he found mushrooms growing between the logs from all the moisture, the wind for insulation, a loss for mold control, but the creativity unmatched. The historian in your mind raises a point. Wasn't snow a risk? Heavy build-up, ice dams, water damage in the spring. Yes, all of that is true if you're not prepared. But these cabins, where the logs were cut from dense, slow-growing trees that naturally resisted rot, the roofs were angled to shed just enough, and any water that trickled in was dealt with using well-placed drainage channels or buckets. This was not clumsy survival. This was calculated adaptation. You ask about ice build-up and someone points out the eaves, long and slanted to keep meltwater from running straight down the walls. Some homes even had little carved gutters or troughs made of hollowed wood, channeling water away from the base. It's all so subtle, so old and so smart. That afternoon, as you shovel snow away, but strategically, you realize how much your instincts have changed. You no longer see snow as a threat. You see it as building material, as blanket, as partner. You pack snow against a low spot in the cabin wall, patting it like mortar. You help cover the firewood pile with a thick white cap, trapping the dryness inside like it's treasure. And when the wind kicks up and the flakes start falling fast and thick, no one rushes to shelter in panic. They welcome it. A fresh coat of snow means a fresh coat of insulation. There's a quirky debate you catch during dinner, whether wet snow is better than dry snow for insulation. Dry snow, someone argues, traps more air, but wet snow packs tighter and sticks better. A quiet man at the end of the table says, mix both. The top layer should crust to keep the soft snow safe underneath. He gets a nod. Apparently, he's the snow expert. He also hasn't worn gloves in 2 weeks. His hands are terrifying. As the cabin tucks in for the night, the wind howls outside, but it's muffled, distant. You press your hand to the log, wall, and feel nothing. No draft, no chill, just stillness. The snowbank outside is doing its job, sealed tight against the base of the house like a frozen quilt. You lie down on the bench, pull the blanket over your shoulders, and smile. Somewhere above you, the roof is carrying a mountain of white silence. And that silence, that weight, that's not a burden, that's insulation. You wake to hushed voices and the soft, rhythmic creak of footsteps, not hurried, but purposeful. The kind of movement that means something serious is happening. But no one wants to disturb the peace. The stove hasn't been stoked yet, and the air is sharp, your breath blooming white in front of your nose. A thin sliver of light filters in through the window, dim but different, not the usual soft gray of another endless snowstorm. There's something warmer about it, like the day is holding its breath. Someone's in labor. You don't mean to intrude, but in a one-room ISB, everything is public. There's no hiding childbirth, just like there's no hiding a death. These things happen right in the middle of the world, on the same benches where people eat, sleep, laugh, and warm their feet by the stove. Life and death are woven into the cabin's fabric, and the ISB, built to hold in heat, must also hold space for all of it. They've cleared the corner, near the stove, the warmest part of the room, and laid out clean linens, a basin of hot water, and a bundle of herbs tied with red thread. The midwife arrived during the night, wrapped in furs and moving like she's done this too many times to count. No one panics, no one rushes, everyone just shifts, adjusts, makes room. A baby is coming, and somehow the whole house knows what to do. You sit quietly, bundled in, your blanket, pretending to sleep, but you listen. There are low murmurs, the sharp gasp of pain, the sound of water being poured. Someone hums an old song, probably older than the ISB itself. It's the kind of melody you hum not because it's pretty, but because your grandmother hummed it, and hers before her. The kind of song that says, "You're not alone, we've done this before. You'll be fine." Childbirth in winter might seem like the worst timing, but in rural Russia, it was sometimes considered the safest. The food stores were full, the fieldwork was long over, and everyone was indoors anyway, focused and available. You could be surrounded by your family, your neighbors, your midwife, and your fire. A baby born now would be strong. Cold season babies had to be. They entered the world with their breath already steaming in the air. There's an intensity to the moment, not dramatic but deep. The logs of the cabin hold the sound. The stove glows softly, its heat turning the space into something sacred. You can almost feel the is itself, holding steady, absorbing the pain, cradling the life as it arrives. And then a new sound, a wail, not loud but clear, the kind of cry that slices through wood and wool and settles into your chest. Someone laughs softly. The midwife says something short and certain. A kettle whistles. And just like that, the room resets. You never even see the baby, just the swaddle, the bundle passed from arms to arms like a fragile ember. A tiny red-faced creature who somehow made it into this world, despite the cold, the smoke, the hard floor, and harder lives. You hear someone whisper, "Strong lungs," and someone else replies, "Winter lungs." By mid-morning, the family's already back in motion. Soup on the stove, firewood stacked, the mother asleep, the child beside her, both wrapped so tightly in wool and linen they look like packages waiting to be delivered. There's no fuss, no hospital bracelets, no birth certificates, no grand announcements, just the quiet knowledge that a life has begun and the Izba has expanded to make room. You ask someone if it's always like this. The quiet, the calm, they nod. We've all been born here in this house, or one just like it. You come in screaming, and the fire welcomes you. That's the way it's always been. You sit with that for a while, sipping hot tea, staring into the fire, and then someone mentions a different kind of silence, the kind that settles when a life leaves, not enters, because death happens here too. The same bench where you warmed your feet last night. Someone died there last winter, peacefully surrounded by family. No hospital bed, no machines, just the slow fading of breath into the warmth of the stove and the shadows of the rafters. When someone passes in the ISB, the body stays for a day or two, washed, dressed, laid out on the table or a bench near the icons. The windows are cracked to let the soul out, a candle is lit, a prayer whispered. The stove is kept warm but not too hot. Bread and salt are set nearby, not just for visitors, but for the departed. It's not grim, it's just normal. You hear a story from one of the elders about a man who died on the pilot stove side with a loaf of bread under one arm and a sleeping cat under the other. Best way to go, she says. Full belly, warm feet, no regrets. And in that moment, you understand something else about the Izba. It's not just a shelter, not just a clever architectural trick. It's a cradle and a coffin, a place for first breaths and last ones, a container for everything human. The scholarly debate continues as always. Some anthropologists argue that the lack of privacy in the ISB, especially during life-changing events, was emotionally stifling. Others say it created an unparalleled intimacy, a closeness that modern housing has completely lost. You're inclined to agree with the second group. You've seen the way people lean into each other here, not because they have to, but because they choose to. That night, the newborn's soft breathing adds a new rhythm to the room, a tiny sound almost lost beneath the stove's low hum and the whisper of a wind outside. But it's there. You lie on your bench and stare at the ceiling where the dried herbs shift slightly in the warm air. The cabin feels different now, not bigger, but deeper, like something has opened up inside the walls. A fresh breath, a new story added to the old ones. And you realize that here in this tight, smoky, endlessly warm wooden box, life is never separate from death. And winter never stops life. It just slows it down, makes space for it to happen deliberately. You pull your blanket higher, smile into the dark, and drift off to the sound of breathing, new, old, human, and otherwise all tangled together in the softest kind of survival. Something feels off the moment you wake up. The stove's still warm. The morning chores have already started, and the goat is chewing hay contentedly in the corner. But there's an odd tension in the air, a stillness like the cabin is holding its breath. No one speaks above a whisper, and when someone sets a cup down, it's done slowly, like the sound might offend someone or something. You glance around and notice a small piece of black bread sitting neatly on the stove ledge, not meant for eating. That's when someone leans over and quietly says, "Don't forget to greet the domovoi." You blink, the what now? The domovoi. They repeat as if it should be obvious. House spirit. And just like that, you find out your cozy, wooden sanctuary comes with a built-in ghost. Not a scary one, supposedly, but definitely one who's paying close attention to everything you do. The domovoi is a creature of legend older than Christianity, older than the cabin itself, and still very much alive in the minds of the people who live here. He's the guardian of the home, the spirit of the hearth, the silent watcher in the corners and rafters. According to folklore, every house has one. If you treat him well, he protects you, keeps the fire burning, warns you about danger, helps the animals stay healthy. But if you disrespect him, well, accidents happen. The family tells you stories over breakfast, half smiling, half serious. There was once a doughboy who turned all the milk sour when a visiting cousin mocked the stove. Another one who pinched children's feet at night if they didn't sweep properly before bed. Someone says their grandfather's cow refused to enter the barn for a week until they left bread out for the domovoi and apologized. You laugh, nervously, and eye the piece of bread on the stove again, starting to feel like you're being watched. There's a small, darkened nook near the stove where you now realize a few objects have been carefully placed. An old coin, a tuft of dried grass, a tiny hand-carved wooden figure wrapped in twine. That's the doughboy's corner, his seat, his space. No one touches it. No one cleans it. It's just there, like the foundation or the chimney woven into the house's DNA. You ask what the domovoi looks like. Responses vary. A small bearded man covered in soot with glowing eyes. A cat-shaped shadow that flickers by the stove when no one's looking. A draft that smells faintly of burned sugar and pine. No one agrees on the details, but everyone agrees he's real. And that belief, that quiet, bone-deep certainty settles into your brain like a seed. So you find yourself doing it, saying hello when you step into the cabin, whispering a thank you when the fire lights easily, leaving a crumb of cake by the stove when the weather is especially cruel. It feels silly, but it also feels comforting, like you're participating in something older than reason. Here's a quirky historical footnote. When Orthodox Christianity swept through the Slavic world, it tried hard to stamp out belief in the domovoi. But instead of vanishing, the spirit adapted. People started calling him the soul of the ancestor, or even jokingly referring to him as a house angel. Churches disapproved. People nodded politely and still left offerings in the rafters. Folklorists debate the origins of the domovoi. Some say he's a holdover from Indo-European hearth deities. Others claim he emerged during the early days of Slavic settlement, when the fire was the literal center of life, and it made sense to imagine it had a soul. One camp argues he's an animistic symbol of household consciousness. Another says he's just a way to scare children into behaving. Both are probably right. And here's the interesting part. The domovoi doesn't just protect the home. He is the home. He lives in the stove, the threshold, the walls. When a family moves, they must invite him to come along or risk leaving behind their luck. Some would sweep out a corner of the old house and symbolically carry the spirit to the new one in a bundle of ash and twigs if the domovoi refused to move. Well, you might as well build again. You ask if people still believe today. Someone shrugs. Not like before, they say, but when things go wrong, bad, dreams, spoiled food, broken tools, it's easier to blame the domovoi than yourself. A pause. And sometimes if you listen carefully, you hear him walking across the ceiling at night. You definitely don't sleep well that night. Still, over the next few days, you begin to sense the rhythm of the house, not just as a structure, but as a presence. It breathes, it watches, it holds. You start noticing things, a broom leaning bristle up by the door, not for storage but to avoid offending the spirit, the way no one whistles indoors. Apparently it summons demons or just makes the domovoi grumpy. The way the stove is always treated with reverence, not just as a tool, but as an altar. The family never says it out loud, but they treat the cabin as something alive, not just inhabited, but inhabited with, a companion through the winter, a silent partner, a character in the story, not just the setting. You start to think of the creaks in the night as conversations, the pop of the stove, bricks as laughter, the drifting curl of smoke as a reminder that something ancient is always watching. And maybe, just maybe, it approves of you. There's an old saying you hear whispered by the grandmother as she tucks a child into bed. If you take care of the house will take care of you. And you realize that in this frozen corner of the world, belief isn't a luxury. It's a survival mechanism. When the snow howls and the wolves are near and the roof groans under the weight of its own insulation, it helps to believe that something small and powerful is on your side. You leave a piece of dried apple on the stove before you go to bed, just in case. You're hauling logs again, because apparently hauling logs is an activity with no end. It's snowing again, and you've lost feeling in your eyebrows. The wood pile is half buried, and someone muttered that it was your turn. And so here you are, digging through crusted snow with your mittened hands and trying to pretend your spine isn't slowly turning to ice. But as you swing the axe and split the next log, someone from the cabin doorway calls out, "Careful! You're cursing the spirits if you do it wrong." You blink, mid-swing. Wrong? What does that even mean? Chop the log the right way, they say. If you're building with it, don't split it before the offering and not on a Monday. Never build on a Monday. You lower the axe, heart thumping with the sudden realization that building a log cabin in Russia was never just a construction project. It was a ceremony, every piece of it. From the first tree fell to the last handful of moss stuffed between the logs. The whole process was soaked in ritual, habit, and a generous splash of superstition. You spend the rest of the day learning just how much more was at play than you ever imagined. The first tree chosen to build the ISB, not random. It had to be healthy, strong, and preferably struck by lightning at least once. No joke. Trees that had survived fire or storms were thought to carry a kind of resilience, that strength would pass into the cabin. You were borrowing nature's battle scars to survive your own. And when you fell that tree, you didn't just chop it down like a lumberjack in a flannel ad. You ask permission out loud with words, an old formula passed down, a request to the forest to release the tree, a promise to use it for good, sometimes even a whispered apology. Some people would leave a coin or a pinch of flour at the roots, a token for the spirits, an offering of respect. Once felled, the tree had to be dragged back again, carefully. It couldn't touch water on the way. It couldn't be dragged bark down. It certainly couldn't be cursed at while moving. You laugh at that one until someone scowls and tells you about a neighbor whose entire cabin was cursed, with bad luck, because the oxen driver swore too loudly during transport. The roof leaked for 20 years. The chickens never laid right. His children all left. You go silent after that. Laying the first log, the Zavalinka, was a ritual in itself, traditionally placed at sunrise, always from east to west, always by the eldest man in the family. Bread and salt were buried under the first log, sometimes coins, sometimes tiny carved dolls. The idea was to offer something of value so the house would be kind, would settle into the earth gently. Even the foundation had a soul to be bargained with. You hear about sacrifice legends too, not actual human sacrifice probably, but stories of builders leaving a doll shaped like a child or even a tiny shoe in the wall as a way of tricking the spirits. Here, this is our firstborn, the story went. Now, don't ask for more. It's chilling, but it's also heartbreakingly clever. A way of outwitting fate, of bargaining with the unknown. There's even a whole etiquette for hammering nails when they finally showed up. That is, you never drove a nail in after sunset. You never built during a thunderstorm. If a log refused to fit after 3 tries, it was unwilling and had to be set aside. Force it, and the house might turn on you later. You look around the cabin now, with fresh eyes. Every corner, every beam has weight beyond just wood and effort. You ask someone what happens if the rituals are skipped. The house won't love you, they say. Then after a pause, you'll always feel like a guest. And you get it. In a land where winters are long and silence gets loud, where you might not see another soul for weeks at a time, a house isn't just a structure. It's a relationship. You live in it, and it lives around you. And like any relationship, it needs tending, courtesy, ritual, a little fear, and lot of respect. And you hear another tale about a man who refused to follow the proper building rites. Just cut. Trees, stacked logs, built fast. His fire never burned right, the stove smoked, the dog wouldn't enter, and on the coldest nights he swore he heard the walls whispering. He moved out the next year, left the ISB but to rot. No one dared take it after that. Historians debate how widespread these rituals really were. Some say they were regional, tied to specific tribes or villages. Others insist they were almost universal, embedded so deeply into peasant culture that skipping them felt like tempting fate. There's even a theory that the rituals existed less for spiritual reasons and more to force builders to slow down, consider each action, and invest emotionally in the space. Maybe. Or maybe they were just trying to stay on the good side of whatever lives between the logs. There's a quirky little belief you learn right before bed. You're not supposed to build an ISB on your birthday. Doing so ties your soul to the house too tightly. If it burns, so do you. If it falls, you fall. You ask if anyone here was ever born in a house they helped build. Only fools, someone replies. You stare at the ceiling that night, tracing the blackened beams with your eyes, thinking about how many hands touched each piece of this place before it became your roof. You think about the bread beneath the first log, the whispered apologies in the woods, the corners never swept too clean in case the domovoi is napping. And you start to realize that this place, this cabin, is more than clever architecture. Spirits are packed between people and trees, between warmth and wood, between seen and unseen. You roll over, listening to the slow crackle of the stove, and whisper something to the wall. Not a prayer exactly, just a quiet thanks, just in case. The first sign that something's changing isn't the temperature, it's the light. Just a little more of it sneaks through the frosted window in the morning. The gray isn't quite as heavy. The shadows are still long, still stretched like sleepy limbs across the log floor, but they're softer now. Less like the claws of winter, more like the fingers of spring tapping gently at the window pane. And, for the first time in weeks, maybe months, someone says the word out loud. Apple, a Thor. You don't believe it at first. The snow's still deep. The air still bites. Your boots still crunch over a surface that could freeze your eyelids open if you blinked too slowly. But people around you are changing. They move with a little more bounce. Doors stay open a beat longer. The chickens linger closer to the threshold, as if trying to remember what grass looks like. And the conversations start to shift from what's needed today to what might happen soon. Because in a place like this, surviving winter isn't just about getting through it. It's about preparing to leave it. Every day that gets longer is a countdown, a hint, a reminder that soon the snow will melt, the mud will rise, and the world will spin into color again, ready or not. But before the snow gives up its grip, there's work to do. So much work. The stove, which has been the heart of the home all season, starts to get a little less greedy. Fires don't burn as hot or as long. You still light it in the morning and again before bed, but the urgency fades. The cabin cools slightly, not cold, just not stifling. People start cracking the windows during the day, letting in slivers of fresh air that feel almost criminal. You realize how stale the air has become over winter, how heavy with smoke, sweat, boiled cabbage, and wood ash. Now it's time to air the bones of the house. Blankets are dragged outside and beaten, senseless with birch sticks. Rugs are shaken. The floor is scrubbed with snow, then wiped with pine vinegar, leaving the room sharp and strangely hopeful smelling. It's spring cleaning, yes, but with the urgency of people who know what rot smells like. Because if you don't purge the winter, it clings in the corners, in your lungs, in your thoughts. You learn that this is also the season of inspection. The logs are checked for signs of moisture. The moss between them is poked, prodded, replaced where necessary. Any damage from the weight of snow or ice is patched, and buckets are strategically placed in case the thaw reveals a leak. You watch a man clamber up the steep roof with the casual balance of a squirrel and dig out the chimney top, hacking away a block of snow like he's sculpting freedom. Firewood is tall. Whatever's left is sorted, dried further, and moved to make room for fresh-cut stacks in the coming months. You don't burn the last of it. You save it just in case spring gets bored and walks away again. Full springs are common, and no one here forgets that April has teeth. Someone shows you how to tap the birch trees, a delicate process of slicing into the bark, fitting a reed or small spout, and placing a jar beneath to collect the sweet watery sap. It's the first taste of the living world since the freeze. A gift. It doesn't give much, not yet, but enough for one glass, enough to feel something shift in your chest, enough to remember that the earth still breathes beneath all this frost. People start to talk about the garden. The word itself feels foreign. Dirt, plants, green things that grow. It's almost too much, but plans are made, seeds are counted. The tools stored in the loft or in the unheated side room are pulled out and sharpened. Someone shows you a crate of old knobbly potatoes. Last year's leftovers already, sprouting tiny green limbs like they're waking from a coma. You're told they'll be planted first as soon as the soil softens, and then there's the melt. It begins slowly, water pooling around the edges of the cabin, trickling off the roof, soaking into everything that had hardened into stone over winter. Then accelerates. The snow starts sinking, collapsing inward on itself. Footpaths vanish into slush. You learn about Rasputita, the season of no roads, when the earth becomes a soup of mud and thawing roots and regret. Nothing moves. Wagons sink. Boots vanish up to the shin, but no one complains. Mud means spring. Inside the cabin you feel the shift, too. People start sleeping without wool hats. The stovetop real estate isn't as fiercely contested. Layers peel away just one at a time, cautiously, like testing the warmth of a lake. You see someone without their scarf indoors and gasp like they've bared their soul. There's a quirky old belief someone shares over tea. If you plant something too early, the domovoi might take offense. He's not done guarding the winter yet, so you're supposed to wait for a certain bird to call or a specific date tied to the Orthodox calendar. Or if you're impatient, you can whisper to the stove and ask if it's ready to rest. If the fire goes out on its own that night, it's a yes. Scholars write about this moment in rural Russian life as a kind of spiritual rebirth. The thaw isn't just the end of winter, it's the release from it, the end of enclosure, the re-expansion of space, both physical and mental. Some historians argue that these cabins, as brilliant as they were for surviving the cold, had a psychological toll. Cabin fever, yes, but also a sense of shrinking self. Come spring, people relearn how to exist outside themselves again. You feel that too, like you've grown roots into the floorboards and now have to unplant yourself awkwardly, gently. You walk outside and stare at the distant line of trees, their dark branches suddenly clearer, no longer lost behind snow. Birds you haven't heard in months start to call timidly, as if testing the air. A few bees, one confused mosquito life. You know it'll snow again, probably twice. You know the mud will drive you mad, but still you start to believe in spring just a little. And inside the izbar, the air is different now. Looser, warmer, as if even the logs themselves are exhaling, shaking off the long sleep. Winter isn't over, but it's retreating. The wolves come at dusk. You're inside, still shaking the melted snow off your boots and warming your hands over the stove. When someone says it, casual, almost offhand, wolves near the forest line, no panic, no raised voices, just a shift in posture. A glance out the window, a pause in spooning out the beet soup, but suddenly everyone is listening. Because wolves in winter aren't fairy tale villains or poetic metaphors. They're real and they're hungry. You haven't heard them before now, but you will tonight. The thaw has softened the snowpack, made the deer harder to chase. Food is scarcer, the balance is tipping, and, with the smell of livestock, smoke, and humans clinging to every log of this cabin, you're a beacon in the night. Someone walks over to the door and bolts it. Not just the latch, but the thick wooden crossbar, a heavy thing carved from solid pine. Another fetches the axe from beside the stove and sets it quietly on the table. It's not paranoia. It's just protocol. Because winter survival in Russia hasn't always been just about the cold. Sometimes it's about keeping things with teeth out. You press your ear to the window pane and wait. For a while there's only the sound of snow melt dripping from the eaves, a distant owl, a branch groaning under its own weight. But then you hear it, a long, low howl too deep and too deliberate to be a dog. It comes from the tree east of the cabin, then another a reply. There's something both beautiful and absolutely terrifying about it. That sound doesn't belong to this warm, quiet cabin. It belongs to the deep dark, to everything the stove holds at bay. You feel it in your ribs. The family isn't scared. Not exactly, but there's alertness now. Generations of instinct, stirring. Someone checks the shutters. Someone else peers up the chimney, making sure the flue is closed tight. You hear hushed conversation about the pig, whether she should be brought deeper into the house. Ultimately, they just throw a heavy wool blanket over her pen and scatter ashes around the perimeter. It smells strange, but apparently the scent masks the warmth. You're reminded that this cabin, sturdy as it is still just wood, still just logs and moss and a bit of brick and stone against a determined pack. It's a barrier of hope more than armor, but it's hope that's been stacked and sealed by hand, passed down, repaired, honored, and so far it's held. You ask if this happens often, more when the winters are long, someone says, or when there's been too much snow or too little, or when the deer don't come. In other words, yes. A story comes out as the soup is ladled and the room settles back into its usual smoky hum. A memory passed down like a cautionary lullaby. There was a man years ago who left his cabin at twilight to fetch firewood just a few steps beyond his porch. He never came back. They found his boots the next morning, half buried in the snow. No blood, no tracks, just silence. The wolves don't always howl when they hunt. Sometimes they come like shadows. That's why no one leaves the ISB during the late winter weeks, not even to check on the livestock unless absolutely necessary. The outhouse is avoided. Chamber pots are used. Windows stay shut, no matter how stuffy the air, because the wolves aren't hunting you specifically, but they wouldn't mind. You sit close to the fire that night. Extra logs loaded into the stove. It's the warmest it's been in weeks, but the warmth doesn't ease the tension. You find yourself checking the door more than once, listening for sounds beyond the walls, and eventually you hear it again, closer. A sen brief and low, followed by something skittering across frozen ground. Hooves? No claws. A chorus of howls erupts not far from the cabin, and it's so sudden, so all-consuming that for a second the world outside feels like it's trying to get in. The goat bleeds once sharply. The chickens shift and cluck uneasily, but no one inside says a word. Because this moment isn't about drama, it's about respect. For the wild, for the hunger. Outside the walls, for the ancient line between fire and frost, between safety and the dark, that waits just a few inches beyond the wood grain. There's a quirky old tradition you learn the next morning. Some families would hang iron bells above the door, not for decoration, but as a last resort alarm. If something brushed against the house, the bells would jingle. Some even smeared lard on tree stumps outside the cabin to distract wolves from sniffing around the walls. Anything to give them a reason to linger elsewhere. Another debate pops up over breakfast. A wolf's worse during the thaw or during deep freeze. One old man insists the thaw is more dangerous. That's when their pride is broken, he says, cold, tired, desperate. They stop fearing humans, start testing the edges. Scholars note that while wolf attacks on humans were rare, they weren't unheard of, especially during years of famine or war when food was scarce and boundaries blurred. Some records from the 19th century describe entire villages keeping fires burning all night just to ward them off. It wasn't hysteria, it was experience. You step outside after dawn, just a few cautious steps, and scan the snow near the tree. No clear tracks, but you feel it like being watched by something patient, something with yellow eyes and a ribcage made visible by a long winter. The forest looks back at you, but the cabin stands. The snow is undisturbed near the door. The fire inside is still warm. You made it through the night again. And the wolves, they moved on. Not because they gave up, but because the cabin held. Because this strange wooden box built with ceremony and sealed with moss and history still knows how to push back against the dark. That night, When you climb into bed with your scarf still wrapped around your neck and the axe closer to the door than usual, you think the cold is a killer. Sure, but at least it's predictable. The wolves remind you that winter doesn't need to be fair to be final. The axe stays by the door for days afterward. No one talks about it, but it's there, leaning against the logs, blade dulled slightly from years of use. The handle smooth from hundreds of hands gripping it, not just to split wood, but to face the unknown. You've noticed by now that in this world, the same tools that keep you warm are the ones that keep you safe. There is no difference between survival and defense, because a Russian log cabin doesn't just protect you from snow and wind, it protects you from everything else. At first glance, the izba doesn't look like a fortress. It's not big, it's not armored, it doesn't have stone walls or a moat. But when you stand inside it, with the wind howling and shadows shifting outside, it sure feels like a stronghold. And that's not an accident. Every inch of this house has been built with the understanding that the world outside is not always friendly. Sometimes it's just cold. Sometimes it's worse. You're told stories as you help mend the fence, simple tasks made strange by the sudden weight of knowing what might be watching. Stories of raiders and thieves, of soldiers and outlaws, whole winters where the danger wasn't just nature, but neighbors, hungry people, angry people, desperate people. When resources were scarce and the nearest help was 3 days' walk away, families relied on their homes to be more than warm. They needed them to be impenetrable. You notice that the front door is thicker than it needs to be for mere insulation, made of solid planks cross-raced and reinforced with hand-forged nails. It cacks when it opens, but only because it's stubborn. The hinges are heavy and mounted deep into the frame. Someone tells you that in the old days doors were sometimes barred from the outside too, to keep something or someone in. You don't ask what they mean. There are small features everywhere that suddenly make sense. The shutters over the windows, for instance, not just to block the cold, but to keep out prying eyes. Thick, wooden, and sealed tight. They latch from the inside and swing inward. In times of trouble, they'd be bolted shut and never opened until it was safe. You imagine someone sitting in the dark for hours, maybe, days, listening for footsteps on the snow. The low profile of the cabin, that cozy, compact feeling that once seemed charming, now reveals its defensive genius. The roofline barely peaks above the drifted snow. In heavy storms it disappears entirely, blending into the land. A house that hides. A house that becomes invisible when it needs to. Even the chimney is discreet. Smoke channeling away rather than up, barely visible against a white-gray sky. You ask about weapons and someone shrugs. The axe, the shovel, a hot poker if needed. There's no militia, no watchtower, just people and tools and instincts. And maybe that's enough. The stove, too, has its place in this silent defense. Not just because it's central, but because it draws people in, keeps them close, keeps them quiet. The heat muffles sound. The thick logs muffle everything else. You could survive a siege in here if you had to. You probably wouldn't want to, but you could. Someone tells you a tale that sounds half folk tale, half warning. An ISB that stood alone near the woods. Its builder, a widow who had lost her husband to a wolf attack. She rebuilt the cabin herself, logs stacked thicker than necessary, no windows, just one narrow door and a chimney that rose like a spine. That winter, a group of bandits tried to take shelter there. They never came out. The locals say she fed them to the stove. Probably a myth, but when you pass her old place abandoned now, you feel your skin prickle, and then there's a quirky custom you come across by accident. In some regions, people used to drive small blades or nails into the doorframe, not for reinforcement but to trap evil. The idea was that spirits or ill will couldn't pass through iron. Over time, these small charms became part of the wood. If you see a door studded with old rusted nails, it's not disrepair. It's armor. Historians debate just how militarized these rural homes ever were. There's little evidence of full-blown fortifications in most villages, but oral traditions speak of black years, seasons when law broke down, and people fended for themselves. In those times, an ISB wasn't just home. It was defense in depth. Logs became walls, ovens became barricades, the household itself a tight-knit militia. You begin to think about what it takes for a structure to offer both comfort and strength, the balance between holding and withholding. The cabin welcomes you, yes, but it also decides what stays outside. The fire draws people together, but the bar door keeps others away. It's not an open concept dream, it's a deliberate layered barrier between your fragile body and the world. At night, you lie in the same spot, but you feel it differently now. The way the wind presses against the walls, the way the beams groan under shifting snow, the way the thick door doesn't even shiver in its frame. You feel inside, protected not just by materials, but by intent. Every log in this place was laid not just for warmth, but for warning. You may come no farther. And yet it's not fear you feel, it's clarity. A strange kind of calm that comes from knowing the cabin isn't passive, it's on your side. If danger came to the edge of the woods, again, wolves or otherwise, you'd hear it. You'd feel the change in the air and the cabin would hold. It always has. The floorboards are moving, not literally, not like in a horror story, but they're making a sound you haven't heard before, a deep, slow creaking, almost like breathing. At first you think it's the log settling or the stove cooling down, but someone near you says quietly, "Spring is waking the house." And weirdly, you believe them because now that you've lived in it for a season, the cabin doesn't feel static. It feels alive, not like a ghost story, not like the doorway creeping across the rafters at night, but like a living creature in the middle of a very long stretch. And yawn, the snow is pulling back from the logs. The frost is draining from the moss, and suddenly the house has space to exhale again. You notice it in the corners. A drip here, a stain there, tiny trails of water threading down the inside of the window frame, a sure sign that the freeze is retreating and the cabin is beginning its annual ritual. Not just surviving spring, but recovering from winter. This is where the real work begins. You might think that spring would bring rest, some kind of reward for enduring the bitter season, but no, spring means movement. It's the season of fixing what the cold broke first. You start with the logs. You go outside with a long iron hook and a bundle of patience and begin peeling away chunks of ice that are still wedged between the walls. The cabin's exterior is soaked now, darkened with thawing moisture, and you're warned that if you don't dry it properly, mold can sneak in, or worse, the logs can swell and crack when the sun comes full strength. So you start drying the house. With the snow melting into thick slush all around, you pile rocks and flat boards under the foundation corners to let the wind pass beneath. You sweep the standing water away from the walls with a broom made of bundled birch. A few of the older logs have split open. Winter checking, they call it, and you're told to pack those cracks tight with fresh moss before the insects wake up. You'd thought the house was tough, and it is. But even the strongest cabin shows its scars in the spring. The eaves drip steadily. The door frame has warped ever so slightly, making it stick when you try to pull it open. You can see a trail of brown water winding its way under the stove where ice had crept in and then fled. Nothing is ruined, but everything needs love. You learn that spring isn't just mud and birdsong, it's the season of listening to your tools, to the wood, to the rhythm of life returning. There's a knock to every log, a feel to every board. A good builder can tell if a wall is healthy just by thumping it with their knuckles and hearing the sound it gives back. Hollow is bad, tight and solid is good. You start testing things, learning that feedback. Keep the house dry and it'll outlive you, someone says, and you believe them. One of the strangest rituals happens when the cabin gets its spring airing. Every window is opened, every blanket, mattress, coat, and cushion is hauled outside and flung over a fence, a tree, a railing. Not just to freshen up, but to drive out what they call the Zimni Duke, the winter spirit. It's not evil, they say, just stubborn. It clings to corners, hides in wool, and smells like cold breath and old soup. You're told to clap, your pillows hard, to shout if you feel silly, to wave a broom in the rafters. The children run around banging spoons. on pots, laughing, yelling, go away, go away. Whether they're chasing winter out or just entertaining themselves, the energy changes. You feel lighter, like the house has just had its sheets changed. And then come the visitors, rodents, insects, mold spores, tiny opportunists who have sensed the change in air and decided your cabin smells like a 5-star hotel. You learn to look for the signs, shredded paper, droppings, the whisper of scratching inside the walls. Someone sets out a trap baited with lard. Another hangs bundles of dried mint and wormwood, not just to smell nice, but to keep bugs away. There's an old custom you hear about, a first sweep of the house done at dawn after the first full thaw. The broom is always new, made by hand, and used to sweep from the stove outward to the door, symbolically pushing the remnants of winter out of the home. The sweepings are burned outside, and you're supposed to spit 3 times over your left shoulder after, for luck, apparently, or just for tradition. Either way, no one skips it. Historians argue over whether this spring cleaning ritual was rooted more in practicality or superstition. But you've been inside this house long enough to know that here, those two things are never far apart. Cleanliness isn't just about hygiene. It's about respect for the home, for the season, for the line between the living world and the stillness winter brings. And speaking of life, the smells are changing. Instead of smoke and sweat and wool, there's a new edge to the air. Damp wood, melting earth, even hints of pine and wet moss. You're not the only one noticing. The chickens are louder. The goat kicks at her pen more. You catch someone lingering by the window longer than usual, staring out toward the field with a look that isn't quite nostalgia and isn't quite dread. It's readiness, because spring doesn't wait. Once it starts, it demands. Repair this, plant that, fix the barn roof, clear the gutters, build a new pen. The cabin once a cocoon now becomes a base camp. You're still sheltering in it, yes, but more and more you're stepping out of it, testing the ground, feeling the season in your bones. You sleep with the windows cracked now, just a sliver. The cold that comes through isn't cruel anymore. It's curious, gentle, asking if you're ready. And the cabin cacks back its answer. Yes, you'd almost forgotten what a sunrise could look like. Not just a slow brightening of gray, but an actual golden, unapologetic burst. Light, rolling over the treetops, painting the snow with honey instead of chalk. You step outside with a cup of tea and nearly drop it, because for the first time since you arrived, you can feel the sun on your face. Actual warmth, not stove heat, not body heat, the sun. You're still ankle deep in wet snow, of course. The trees are dripping like nervous witnesses. The mud is ankle-hungry and your boots squelch in a way that makes you question the waterproofing claims on the tag. But none of that matters, because spring isn't just a change of weather. It's a resurrection, and the cabin is rising with it. You start noticing things that weren't there before. A patch of ground where moss has reappeared, bright green and defiant. A cluster of brave little weeds forcing their way up through the slush near the outhouse and the birds. The noise is unbelievable. It's like every feathered thing in a 100-mile radius picked this week to start yelling about territory and mates and worms. You stand still for a moment and feel like the air itself has texture, life texture. After months of snow silence, it's borderline overwhelming. Inside the ISB, the energy has shifted. The fire is down to a flicker now, still lit in the mornings out by midday. The stove still holds a kind of ceremonial authority, but it's not the tyrant it used to be. People aren't huddling around it anymore. They're drifting toward the door, toward windows propped open with sticks, toward anything that smells like soil. The walls have started drying from the outside in, and that scent, that cabin drying smell fills every breath. It's like pine and dust and old bark and sunlight filtered through age. You're told that if you smell that and don't feel something ancient stir inside you, you probably don't belong here. He helps scrub the floor again, but this time not to chase out winter. This time it's about welcoming the next season in. There's a difference in intention, and it's weirdly emotional. Someone brings out a bucket of water mixed with fresh herbs, juniper, sage, even chopped garlic. The scent fills the room like a promise. You use a handful of straw tied into a loose mop and scrub in long, slow circles. Not just cleaning, but blessing. It's around this time that people start sleeping differently. Instead of curling in layers under heavy quilts, you're seeing people toss off blankets, stretch more, even fall asleep near open windows. Dreams get louder, longer. You overhear someone say, "The spring dreams have started," and you're too afraid to ask what that means. But you start remembering your own now vivid, strange, full of running water and distant singing. You're told that means your body is realigning with the season. There's a quirky little tradition you're pulled into almost accidentally. You wake up one morning to find your pillow gone, not just yours, everyone's. They're airing them out, apparently. Pillows, blankets, even the stuffed sacks that serve as mattresses are dragged outside and beaten with sticks, fluffed, and left in the sun for hours. It's not just about dust. It's about letting the winter leave the bed. A belief that sleep holds on to the season, and that you can trap the cold in your pillow if you don't shake it out. You also find yourself helping with something called the first harvest. Though nothing is actually being harvested yet, it's symbolic. You walk with the others to the edge of the forest where the trees are still mostly bare and help cut the first fallen branches for kindling. Not firewood, not heat, just kindling. These early twigs gathered respectfully are used to start the first outdoor cooking fires of the season. The coals from the stove light them. It's a kind of seasonal handshake from the old flame to the new. Scholars have debated whether Russian peasant life truly marked these small seasonal shifts so consciously or if modern nostalgia has romanticized the process. But standing here watching a woman kneel beside a sap-sticky birch stump and light a careful flame while whispering a line of verse you don't recognize, you're inclined to believe it. This isn't decoration. It's dialogue with the land, with the house, with the cycle of survival. You even hear mention of the Green Week approaching, a pre-Christian tradition that's been woven into Orthodox spring rites, a time when homes are decorated with young branches and fresh leaves, and every doorway is supposed to be lined with greenery to invite growth. Some even place little bouquets inside cracks in the walls, coaxing nature to come inside. And yes, the Isba is still involved. You ask what happens if you don't honor Green Week. Someone shrugs. The garden might sleep too long. Speaking of the garden, it's time. The snow's retreated enough to reveal the raw, cold soil behind the house. Still a bit frozen in spots, still heavy and wet, but visible, touchable, and the tools come out like magic. Forks, hoes, old rusted things that look more like weapons than gardening equipment. All laid out like ritual objects on a burlap sheet. You watch as someone scoops a handful of earth, sniffs it and nods. Another, week, they say, but the planning begins. Seeds are sorted, beds are raked clear, a compost heap is reborn. You find yourself staring at this strange brown rectangle of ground with an odd kind of reverence. It looks dead, but you know, better now. The same way the cabin looked asleep all winter. This dirt is just holding its breath. You ask about what's planted first. Potatoes, of course. Always potatoes, then onions, garlic, cabbages if there's still time, and herbs, mint, dill, chamomile, planted not just for food, but for medicine, for offerings, for scent. Everything has a purpose here. Even the weeds get used for something if you're clever. There's a shared understanding, now, spoken or not, that the season has turned. The house isn't your only world anymore. It's still your anchor, your shelter, your stove, your soul. But now it has competition. The fields are calling. The air is too sweet, the light too generous. Winter lets you live, spring demands you move. That night you sleep with the window wide open, listening to frogs, real frogs, croaking like drunk accordion players in the marsh beyond the trees. You smile because frogs mean puddles. Puddles mean melt, and melt means you're going to make it. Now comes the part no one warned you about. Not because they forgot, but because it's too hard to explain until you feel it for yourself. You've made it through the cold, the silence, the wolves, and the creaking dread of a house pressed tight against winter. You've helped repair the moss-chinking air, the linens whispered to the stove and listened for melting icicles in the eaves. Spring is here, and yet you don't really want to leave the cabin. It's not that you don't love the light, you do. The sun now hangs over the fields like a lazy watchman, trailing gold across the thatch roof and sending birds into a fever pitch by 5 a.m. But there's something oddly painful about it, too, as if the walls of the ISB have become a second skin, and peeling away from them feels a bit like shedding a life. All those months pressed against firewood, humans, animals, heavy quilts, and shared breath have rewired your instincts. The cabin held you. Now you're supposed to let it go. No one talks about the sadness of spring, but it's there, like when the baby goat finally outgrows sleeping inside and gets moved to the pen, or when the stove goes a whole day without being lit for the first time and the room feels hollow, or when someone opens the root cellar and starts hauling out the last of the pickled cabbage and you realize the winter stores are almost gone. Not because they ran out, but because they lasted. And that's a different kind of emotion entirely. You find yourself lingering indoors longer than needed, sitting by the stove even when it's cold, running your fingers along the grooves in the log wall, tracing names carved there decades ago, maybe centuries. You notice initials in the old Russian script, dates that go back to the 1800s, a heart with 2 names inside it. The house remembers everything, every cough, every lullaby, every silent moment when someone stared out the window and waited for spring just like you did. And now it's time to leave the cabin alone for hours at a time, to plant, to haul water, to repair the fence, to chase the chickens out of the garden and weep gently when they get in. Anyway, the ISBA doesn't complain. It knows this rhythm. It's used to being the center in winter and the background in spring. You get the sense it almost prefers this quieter role. No longer life support, but still watchful. You hear a story one afternoon while fixing a rake about a woman long ago who refused to sleep outside the ISB, even in the warmest months. She'd pitch a tent in the field with the others during harvest, then sneak back in to lie beside the cold stove like it was her pillow. She said she dreamed better under logs, someone mutters with a shrug. Maybe she was right. There's a quirky belief you come across in a half-joking, half-serious conversation about the cabin having a spring sulk. Apparently, if you abandon it too fast, move out into summer, kitchen, sleep in the hoft, stop tending the hearth, the ISB might get offended. Doors might start sticking. The floor might cack too loudly at night. The bread won't rise quite right. Is it superstition? Of course. But you start lighting a little fire once in a while anyway, just so it doesn't feel forgotten. Scholars sometimes call this emotional attachment to peasant homes a form of domestic animism, the belief that houses are not just shelters, but beings in their own right, not quite gods, not exactly spirits, but something sacred. You used to think that was poetic exaggeration. Now you're not so sure. You realize that despite everything, you're going to miss this place, miss the smoke in your clothes, the way the frost used to etch silver ferns on the windows, the warmth of a crowded room when everyone breathed in time with the fire, even the endless shoveling, the frozen outhouse seat, the walls that never once let the wind through. You understand now why some people never wanted to leave their ISBAs, even as cities grew and electricity came and better housing arrived. This wasn't backwardness or poverty or resistance to change, it was love. The kind of love you feel for something that kept you alive. Not abstractly, but literally something that gave you shelter when the world could kill you just for going outside. And even as the mud dries and the days grow, long and green, the cabin continues its quiet work. Holding the cool in during hot afternoons, guarding the pickles and salted fish in the cellar, catching the scent of dill and pine drifting through the windows, housing icons that never come down, offering shade when you come in from the garden with aching legs and dirt under your nails. One day, a neighbor mentions that they're planning to repaint the outer logs. not with modern paint, but with a traditional mixture of milk, ash, and ox blood. The old protective coating that kept bugs out and spirits in you offer to help. As you slap the mixture onto the rough logs with a handful of bundled twigs, the scent hits you. Earthy, sour, rich with history. It smells like memory, like permanence. And that night, something small but important happens. You hear a creak from the stove even though no one lit it, just a faint shift in the bricks. Not unsettling, just a reminder. The house is still there, still breathing, still watching. You sleep with the window open again, the breeze carrying in the smell of warm grass and distant rain. But this time, your dreams don't pull you toward the sky. They pull you downward into the floorboards, into the moss between the logs, into the dark, warm heart of the ISB. Because even though the season is changing and the world is blooming, part of you will always belong to the winter inside this cabin. One morning, before the sun's fully up, and before anyone else is stirred, you slip out of the cabin alone. Not for firewood, not to check on the goat, not to chase the chickens away from the garden again, but just to walk. The ground is soft beneath your boots now, a mix of new grass and squishy earth. And for once, there's no urgency to your steps. You don't need to gather anything. You don't need to fix or carry or stir or haul. You just want to feel the air and stretch your legs beyond the cabin's reach. Behind you, the Isba crouches low, half sunken into the land as always, stoic and weathered, logs dark with age and spring dew. Smoke doesn't pour from the chimney anymore, just wisps now and then, thin and almost bashful, like the stove doesn't want to bother anyone. You stand at the edge of the clearing and look back at it, and it hits you how small it is, not in a bad way, not weak, just compact, purposeful, and how very big it had felt when winter wrapped the world in silence and left that cabin as your entire universe. Now the world is open again, and it feels almost too big. You walk into the forest just far enough that the roofline disappears behind the birches. The air smells like sap and soil and the sharp sweetness of something blooming. The snow is gone except in hidden pockets, under fallen logs and in the north-facing hollows where the sun can't reach. A trickle of water runs through a gully, and nearby a bird lets out a call so loud and joyful it startles a laugh out of your mouth. Life is back, like it never left, like it never paused. But you know better. You crouch near the stream and dip your hand in. The water's still shockingly cold, as if winter's ghost is still flowing beneath the thaw. And for a moment, you remember the way your fingers ached every time you drew water from the well in January. The way the ice on the bucket rim could slice skin. You remember how that first sip in the morning had the weight of a miracle. It's easy to forget the pain of winter when it's over. Easy to think it wasn't so bad, but it was. You know it was. You probably shouldn't have survived it. Back at the cabin, life has shifted into its spring rhythm. The early planting is done. The stove, once your constant companion, is now more of an afterthought, used for cooking but no longer vital. Blankets have been folded and tucked away. The double-layered windows, remember those, have been removed. The inner glass cleaned and stored, the frames stacked like sleepy eyelids, waiting for next year. Everyone moves lighter, breathes deeper, speaks louder. But even now, there's an unspoken reverence for what the house did. You hear it in little things, the way someone touches the stove with a flat palm as they pass it, the way no one sits on the pallet without giving it a little nod first. There's respect in the routine. You're told that this is but has seen over 100 winters. And suddenly that seems impossible. Not because it doesn't look strong, but because you know how much it takes to survive just one. You think about the generations that have huddled inside these walls, hearts pounding in storms, ears tuned for wolves, fingers blistered from hauling wood, the tears cried over births and deaths, the songs hummed into the night, the arguments muffled by thick log walls. This house has seen things, and you start to understand something important. This wasn't just about comfort. The cabin didn't just make things better. It made them possible. In a place where the cold can stop a heartbeat, where the dark can swallow a soul, and where the snow can hide every sign of life for months, the Isba is more than shelter. It's a declaration. A stubborn, creaking, moss-stuffed, smoke-tinted declaration. We will live here anyway. And now, with the worst behind you, you're left with something unexpected. Gratitude. Not just for warmth or survival or food, but for the chance to have seen how something so simple, logs, stone, clay, moss, can become a fortress of humanity. A container for everything fragile and important. You help with one last task, sealing up the cracks between the logs with fresh moss. The old stuff has dried and flaked away in some places, and now, as the house adjusts to the heat and dampness of spring, new gaps open. You work with your hands, pressing soft, wet green into the seams, knowing that by next winter it'll be hard as bark again. The logs groan under your touch, shifting slightly as they always do, breathing just a little. You press your ear to the wall just for fun and swear you hear something, a whisper maybe, or just the echo of everything you felt here. There's a final quirky tradition someone insists on upholding, writing your name inside the doorframe, not visible to the world, tucked deep where only those who know where to look will ever find it. A pencil scratch among hundreds of others, names, initials, dates. You carve yours with a pocket knife, careful, small, just enough to say, I was here, I mattered. Because in a place like this, the house remembers. By dusk, the air is warm enough that no one bothers lighting the stove at all. A pot of soup simmers outside over a tripod. The fire, crackling lazily. Its smoke, twisting up through green buds just beginning to unfurl on the nearby trees. You sit on a bench near the threshold, half in, half out, and watch the day fade. Inside, the ISB is quiet, peaceful, waiting. You know it'll welcome the next cold season when it comes. You know it'll cradle another winter, another family, another long stretch of frost and silence. That's what it was built to do. That's what it will always do. But for now, it rests, and so do you. So here we are on the quiet side of the storm. You've walked the whole stretch through snowbanks taller than you, through creaking logs and smoky air, through the long cold echo chamber of a Russian winter held at bay by nothing more than wood, fire, and sheer determination. And now you're standing in the soft hush of spring, the Isba behind you breathing, easy for the first time in months. The moss is green, the axe is resting, the stove is quiet. And you? You survived. You did more than that, really. You learned how a house made of trees could think, how a fire could speak, how belief, old, wild, half-whispered belief, could warm the bones just as much as heat. You watched a baby born a few feet from the firebox. You saw wolves blink from the edge of the woods and walk away. You left food out for invisible guardians. You stomped your boots and laughed and wept and waited, and through it all the cabin held you. That's the strange magic of these places. They weren't just shelter, they were systems, memory machines, ancestral armor. You walk into one thinking it's just a hut, and by spring you realize you've been living inside a living thing. A house with moods and habits. A house that doesn't just keep out the cold, but makes space for everything else. Grief, joy, birth, death, sour cabbage, hot tea, gossip, ghosts, goats, and one very cranky house spirit. You didn't just survive winter in a Russian log cabin. You learned how it survives you. So now, before you drift off, because I know you're close, picture it one more time. That cabin low and strong in the clearing. Snow melting off its roof in long, slow tears, smoke curling upward like a sigh. Inside, the last of the fire glows in the stove. The domovoi is napping somewhere in the rafters, satisfied. And you? You're tucked under layers of history, of heat, of stories, passed down with smoke on their breath. Sleep well, friend. The cold can't touch you.